This evening, as dusk settles and peaceful shadows envelop the world, we will embark on an extraordinary journey. It will be an unhurried yet captivating dive into the depths of an ancient world, where fate was once forged and gods whispered their secrets to mortals. Let the day's clamour subside, wrap yourself in comfort, and prepare to encounter the mysterious Oracle of Delphi. Imagine yourself stepping along a dusty, winding mountain path, carved into the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in the very heart of ancient Greece. The Mediterranean sun gently warms your shoulders as you ascend slowly but steadily. Below, as far as the eye can see, stretch endless olive groves, like an emerald carpet reaching towards the shimmering sea in the distance. But your path does not lead to the coast. Your destination is the summit, where the trail, polished by countless pilgrims' footsteps over hundreds of years, leads. As you climb, you begin to notice other travellers. There is an Athenian merchant, his donkey heavily laden with pottery destined for sale. Beside him walks a farmer's wife, carefully carrying a humble offering wrapped in linen. A little ahead, a young soldier, clad in bronze armour, his shield strapped to his back, his spear resting lightly in his hand. All these people, so diverse, are united by one quiet yet profound purpose. They are all heading to the same sacred place. They are all going to Delphi, the most revered sanctuary of the ancient Greek world, a place where Apollo himself descends to speak with mortals. But how, you might ask, did this mountain acquire such exceptional significance? How did this rocky slope, overgrown with wild laurel trees, transform into the spiritual and cultural heart of the ancient world? The history of this place begins long before the appearance of magnificent temples and priests, in those distant times when the world was still young and mighty old gods walked freely upon the earth. This mountain was sacred even then, but its sanctity was not linked to Apollo. Long ago, before the golden-haired god of music, poetry, and prophecy claimed this site as his own, it belonged to an entirely different being. Deep beneath the rocks, in a cave that yawned like a massive maw in the mountainside, dwelt Pythia. This was no ordinary snake basking on a sunny garden wall. Pythia was a creature of colossal size, a serpent so enormous that, coiling around the mountain, its mighty body is said to have created the very path that pilgrims now ascend to the summit. Pythia was ancient when the world was newly formed, born from the earth itself. Some legends say that after the great waters of Deucalion's flood finally receded, leaving the earth muddy and fertile, the giant serpent had lived in this cave for so long that the local inhabitants built their own sacred traditions around it. An oracle already existed in this cave, a reliable way for mortals to communicate with divine forces. However, this oracle served older gods, primordial earth powers that ruled the world before Zeus and his family took over the heavens. People from all over the Greek world came here to ask their questions of Pythia's oracle. They brought offerings of honey and barley cakes, and a priestess interpreted the serpent's movements, the slight tremors of the earth as Pythia stirred in his deep cave, and the mysterious patterns of vapour rising from cracks in the rock. It was a peaceful, established order that lasted for generations, until Apollo decided this place should be his. Apollo in those days was still young by the standards of the gods. He was born on the floating island of Delos with his twin sister Artemis. His mother, Leto, had wandered the world for a long time seeking a place to give birth. As Hera, ever jealous of Zeus's children by other women, had forbidden any land from sheltering her. But Apollo grew quickly, as is characteristic of divine children. Just a few days after birth, he was already tall, beautiful, and strong. His golden hair caught the light like woven sunshine. His voice, when he sang, could move even stones to tears with its beauty. And from his father, Zeus, he inherited an unwavering determination to get what he desired. Apollo yearned for his own oracle, his own sacred place where mortals could come to inquire about the future. But he didn't want just any mountain or any cave. He sought the best. He wanted the most renowned oracle in the known world. He wanted Delphi. So Apollo ascended the mountain path much as you might walk it today. Though his divine feet likely didn't kick up dusty clouds, and his breath certainly didn't quicken with the effort of the climb. Gods do not get winded. When he reached the sacred cave, he called out to Pythia. What happened next depends on the storyteller. Some traditions describe a grandiose battle, where Pythia's massive coils crushed trees and Apollo's silver arrows flew like falling stars, piercing the darkness. Others claim it was more of a cosmic confrontation, filled with divine posturing and threats, but without much violence. One thing, however, we know for certain. When the encounter concluded, Pythia was dead, and Apollo claimed the cave and the oracle as his own. One might expect Apollo to simply adopt the existing traditions, allowing things to continue as before. But Apollo was a god of change, of new ideas, of the order that springs from art and music and carefully considered thought. The old earth oracle was mysterious and primal, all vapor, serpent dreams, and ancient wisdom rising from the deep recesses of the mountain. Apollo's oracle needed to be different. First, he needed to purify the place. Ancient Greeks believed that death, even the death of a creature as ancient and powerful as Pythia, left a spiritual stain that needed to be cleansed before new sacred work could begin. So Apollo performed rituals of purification, burning fragrant herbs and pouring wine and oil onto the stones, chanting hymns that echoed through the mountain peaks. But even purification was not enough. Apollo had killed Pythia, and in the ancient world that made him a murderer. Even gods had to account for killing. So Apollo left his new sanctuary and journeyed far, to the land of the Hyperboreans in the distant north, where he spent 8 years in exile, atoning for Pythia's death. 8 years. Imagine this mountain without its new god, empty of pilgrims, the cave entrance dark and silent. The local inhabitants must have wondered if their sacred place would ever come alive again. The merchants, farmers, and soldiers who had for generations ascended the mountain path must have felt lost, cut off from the divine guidance they had always known. But after 8 years, Apollo returned. And when he returned, he brought with him the most beautiful temple the ancient world had ever seen. In reality, it wasn't quite like that. Apollo didn't so much bring a temple as inspire people to build it. The returned god filled the local communities with a divine enthusiasm, a shared vision of what this sacred place could become. Stone masons began to arrive from all over Greece, along with architects, artists, and craftsmen of all kinds. The temple they built was designed to be perfect in every way. Its columns were precisely proportioned according to mathematical principles that would later be called the golden ratio. Its sculptures were carved by the greatest artists of the age, immortalizing myths and heroes. And inside, at the very heart of the temple, in the inner sanctum where only the priestess could enter, Apollo placed his sacred tripod, a three-legged bronze seat that would become the throne of his oracle. But wait, if Apollo was a god speaking through an oracle, why did he need a priestess at all? Why didn't he speak directly to the people who came with questions? This is one of those wondrous mysteries of the ancient world that we will probably never fully understand. Perhaps Apollo, being a god of harmony and balance, believed that divine truth needed to be filtered through human understanding to be useful to mortal minds. Perhaps the overwhelming power of a god's direct voice would be too much for ordinary people to bear or comprehend. Or perhaps, and this explanation makes the most sense if you quietly think about it, perhaps Apollo understood that the very act of asking questions and seeking guidance was as important as the answers themselves. Think about it. You climb a dusty mountain path for hours, overcoming fatigue and doubt. You stand in line with other pilgrims, each of them nervous, full of hope and uncertainty. You bring your offering and speak your question aloud to the priestess, who serves as the voice of the god, a bridge between worlds. And then you listen, truly listen to the answer you receive, pondering every word. This entire process changes you to your core. The journey, the waiting, the intense moment of asking, the careful attention to the answer, all of it together creates a kind of meditation, a deep reflection on your life and your choices that you might never have undertaken if Apollo had simply appeared in your living room and answered your questions while you folded laundry. The Oracle at Delphi was not just a source of information about the future. It was about the experience of seeking wisdom, about the spiritual discipline of asking the right questions and being genuinely open to guidance, even if that guidance might not be what you wanted to hear. And Apollo's oracle became famous for giving guidance that was technically accurate, but required careful interpretation, forcing the questioner to think deeply. The god was not trying to be difficult or mysterious for the sake of mystery. He was teaching people to ponder their choices deeply, to consider multiple possibilities, to approach important decisions with the kind of careful deliberation that leads to true wisdom. And people came. Oh, how they came. Kings and farmers, soldiers and merchants, young brides and worried mothers, philosophers and poets, and astute politicians. They came from all corners of the Greek world, and then from beyond, travelling vast distances. They brought offerings of gold and silver, exquisite bronze tripods and fine fabrics, animals for sacrifice and simple flowers gathered along the mountain path. And slowly, over years, decades and centuries, Apollo's oracle at Delphi became more than just a sacred site. It transformed into the pulsating centre of the ancient world, where destinies intertwined and prophecies were born, whose echoes resonate to this day. Delphi evolved into a true spiritual epicenter of all Hellenic civilization. It was a sacred space where Hellenes from various city-states found common ground for meetings, where fateful decisions regarding military conflicts and peace treaties, the founding of new settlements, the development of legislation, the holding of festivals, and the resolution of great existential questions were brought for consideration and divine patronage. The deity, once a young celestial rebel who audaciously appropriated another's sacred cave for his own ambitions, created a truly holy place, a meeting point of heaven and earth, where the boundless wisdom of the pantheon could directly address the transient concerns of human souls. And in the deep hours of the night, when the last seeker of truth, having received their answer, had already begun their descent from the mountainside, when the flames of the temple lamps barely flickered, and the entire mountain was enveloped in serene darkness, Apollo himself would sometimes take up his golden lyre. He would draw melodies from it that echoed through the mountain peaks and deep valleys. The beauty of this music was so captivating that even wild animals would approach the temple steps to listen. It seemed to encompass the full range of joys and sorrows of fleeting human existence, transformed into something eternal and flawless. The deity whose lot was to foretell the future found his true purpose. His mission was not merely to predict events, but to prompt people to deeply ponder what was to come. Not only to provide answers to questions asked, but to instruct mortals in the art of formulating deeper and more meaningful inquiries. And so a new day will dawn when the sun's rays once again illuminate the majestic peaks of Mount Parnassus, and the temple colonnades catch the first light of dawn. New lines of pilgrims will begin their ascent along the ancient path. They will follow in the footsteps of countless truth-seekers who walked this way before them. Each one harboured the hope of hearing the voice of a God who chose to communicate through human wisdom rather than through direct divine decrees. But how did the oracle itself function in its daily operations? What was life and work like in the most sacred place of the ancient world? To find answers, let's climb a little higher up the mountainside and observe carefully. As the first pale hints of dawn touched the majestic peaks of Mount Parnassus, a piercing rooster's crow echoes. Below in the deep valley, the surrounding world is still enveloped in the soft blanket of pre-dawn mist. Here, in Delphi, however, the sacred precinct is already beginning to stir to life. The awakening happens in a modest stone house, nestled comfortably on the hillside. It is one of dozens of similar dwellings clustered tightly around the magnificent temple, like children gathered at their mother's skirt. From a narrow window opening, there is a view of the temple columns, which are already catching the first rays of the rising sun. Their marble surfaces begin to radiate a warm, honeyed glow, making them appear less like stone and more like solidified sunlight. This dwelling belongs to him. He is one of many inhabitants who live here permanently, whose entire life is inextricably linked to maintaining this sacred place and serving the thousands of pilgrims who annually ascend the mountain in search of Apollo's divine guidance. His day begins, like any other day in Delphi, with a ritual of purification. Before stepping onto sacred ground, before touching any sacred objects or commencing his duties, one must cleanse oneself of the defilement of the mundane world. He descends the slope to the Castalian spring, where cold, crystal-clear water gushes from the mountain depths, flowing in a continuous stream into the valley below. This spring is revered as sacred to Apollo and the Muses, the 9 divine sisters who patronize all forms of art, poetry, and music. Ancient legends claim that anyone who tastes the water from this spring or bathes in its currents will be endowed with poetic inspiration. For him and other temple servants, however, the spring serves a more pragmatic function. Its icy water is an ideal means to shake off the remnants of sleep and prepare the mind for the sacred activities ahead. He is not alone at the spring. Other early risers are already there, temple priests performing their morning ablutions. A few pilgrims who arrived late the previous day and seek to purify themselves before approaching the oracle. Even local shepherds leading their flocks to the mountain slopes for grazing. All exchange polite nods, but conversations are held in hushed whispers. The early morning hours in Delphi are a time for silent contemplation, for allowing the sacred aura of the place to deeply penetrate one's very being. Having washed his hands and face and offered a brief prayer to Apollo, he ascends back towards the temple, though he does not go there directly. Other duties await him first. He serves in the Athenian treasury, one of many elegant marble structures picturesquely lined along the sacred way, the path pilgrims take as they ascend to the temple. Each of these treasuries was erected by a different Greek city-state to house its offerings to Apollo, and also to display its own wealth and piety to visitors from rival cities. The Athenian treasury stands out for its exquisite beauty. Its walls are adorned with magnificent marble reliefs depicting the heroic adventures of Theseus and Heracles. In this early, still grey pre-dawn hour, however, his thoughts are occupied less with artistic perfection than with purely practical matters. He needs to meticulously check the locks, ensure there have been no attempts at intrusion during the night, and prepare the treasury to receive the day's visitors. The interior of the treasury greets him with cool, still air. Golden artifacts softly gleam in the subdued light filtering through the doorway. Here are tripods crafted from precious metals, their 3 legs skillfully carved in the shape of serpents, a tribute to Pythia, the monster slain by Apollo. Nearby rest silver bowls, their surfaces adorned with delicate engravings depicting scenes of heroic battles and lavish feasts. There are also bronze mirrors, polished to a reflective sheen, their surfaces mirroring the viewer's face like dark, serene water. However, the most valuable offerings are those not intended for public display. These are papyrus and parchment scrolls containing meticulously documented records of every prophecy uttered by Apollo's Delphic oracle for generations. These priceless documents are the true treasure of Delphi. Surpassing in significance all the gold and silver combined, they represent centuries of divine guidance, serving as written testimony to how divine will shape the course of history for the entire Greek world. He scrupulously inspects each container, ensuring that the scrolls are safely protected from damaging moisture and pests. Some of these prophecies gained wide renown throughout the ancient world. Others were purely private, given to ordinary people who asked everyday questions. Should I marry this person? Will my sick child recover from illness? Is now a favorable time for sowing crops? As he goes about his work, he hears the sounds of the temple coming alive around him, footsteps on stone paths, the soft swish of brooms sweeping dust from marble floors, the gentle lowing of cattle being led up the mountain for sacrifice, voices quietly exchanging greetings as various temple servants begin their daily duties. By the time he finishes his duties in the treasury, the sun has fully cleared the eastern mountain peaks, and the temple precinct is bathed in radiant golden light. Now comes perhaps the most beautiful part of his day, the morning procession. Every day in Delphi, the day begins with a solemn procession from the sacred spring to the temple. Priests clad in pure white robes and crowned with laurel wreaths move slowly along the sacred way, accompanied by musicians playing flutes and lyres. The melody is invariably the same, an ancient hymn to Apollo, which has been performed in Delphi for so many generations that no one remembers the name of its original composer. He joins this procession along with all the other temple servants and pilgrims who have arrived early enough to participate in this sacred act. The pace of movement is deliberately slow, meditative. This is not merely a way of moving from one point to another. It is a carefully structured ritual designed to help every participant, priests, servants, and pilgrims, transition from the mundane world of daily concerns into the sacred space where gods engage in dialogue with mortals. As he proceeds, he passes all the treasuries and monuments that have brought Delphi worldwide fame. His gaze sweeps over the Cnidian treasury with its striking marble caryatids, columns skillfully carved as graceful female figures, supporting the roof on their heads. Then, past the Naxian monument, crowned with a sphinx carved from a single block of marble. Further on, the Theban treasury, where Alexander the Great himself once came to seek Apollo's blessing before embarking on his campaign to conquer the world. Each of these structures tells its own story. Each embodies a triumph or a tragedy, a pivotal moment when a Greek city-state felt compelled to thank Apollo for his guidance or to seek his protection. Passing them each morning, he is reminded anew that Delphi is not merely a religious site. It is a sacred space where the entire Hellenic world converges to reflect on its past and chart the contours of its future. The procession reaches the temple just in time for the morning sacrifice. A pristine white bull, its horns skillfully gilded and its body adorned with garlands of fragrant flowers, is slowly led to the altar situated before the main entrance of the sanctuary. The animal appears calm, almost dozing in the gentle rays of the morning sun. The priests carefully inspect it, searching for any flaws or signs of ill health that might render it unsuitable as an offering to the deity. But this bull, as always, proves to be perfect. The inhabitants of Delphi take deep pride in offering only the very best to Apollo. The animal is quickly and humanely sacrificed. Its blood is spilled upon the ancient altar stones while prayers and hymns ascend to the brightening sky. This sacrifice serves several crucial functions. Firstly, it provides meat for the temple kitchens, where hundreds of people need to be fed daily. Secondly, it creates sacred smoke, which rising to the heavens carries human prayers into the realm of the gods. And finally, it establishes the necessary ritual purity, allowing Apollo to speak through his oracle. It should be noted that the oracle does not function daily. In fact, she utters prophecies only once a month, on the 7th day after the new moon, a date sacred to Apollo's birth. And even on this special day, predictions are given only if the omens are favourable, only if the gods clearly indicate their willingness to engage in dialogue with mortals at that specific moment. Today was not designated for the oracle's prophetic revelations. This day's schedule, known to the priests as a maintenance day, was reserved for routine yet vital tasks. Thorough cleaning and organisation, receiving visitors who came with gifts or seeking clarification on temple rituals, and for transcribing key documents and updating registers that recorded the mandatory tributes to Apollo from various cities. Consequently, instead of the usual intense mystical aura that enveloped prophetic sessions, a calmer, almost cosy atmosphere prevailed on this day. Temple servants diligently cleaned marble floors of dust and polished bronze decorative elements to a mirror-like sheen. Scribes secluded themselves in cool, shaded corners, painstakingly transcribing ancient prophecies onto fresh papyrus scrolls. Artisans, meanwhile, were engaged in restoring damaged sections of buildings and monuments, their hammers producing a soft, rhythmic chime as they met stone and metal. A significant portion of the morning hours was dedicated to assisting in the organization of new gifts that had arrived with pilgrims the previous day. Among them stood out an exquisite silver bowl, having arrived from prosperous Corinth, with an intricately engraved plea for Apollo's patronage over their merchant ships. Nearby lay a bronze mirror, a gift from a woman from Sparta whose son had miraculously recovered from a debilitating fever after her sincere prayers to the deity. Of particular note was a miniature ivory figurine, evidently brought from some distant colony, crafted with astonishing skill and depicting Apollo himself gently playing his lyre. Each of these offerings required meticulous recording, the name of the donor, the date of presentation, and the essence of the request made to Apollo. Such records served a dual function, fulfilling both utilitarian and sacred purposes. In a practical sense, they provided temple administrators with an indispensable tool for accounting for their extensive treasures, ensuring the preservation of each item and preventing any losses or thefts. From a spiritual perspective, these scrolls and tablets carefully preserved the memory of each devotee's unique relationship with the deity, forming a kind of unceasing dialogue between Apollo and his faithful worshippers, extending through centuries and generations. Around noon, when the scorching sun reached its zenith and the majestic marble columns cast sharp, clear shadows on the temple floor, the afternoon guests began to arrive. These individuals were not among the suffering pilgrims who came to Delphi seeking prophetic answers. They were, in a way, noble travellers, wealthy Hellenes from various city-states, whose purpose was to witness the famous Oracle sanctuary firsthand, present modest gifts, and upon returning home, proudly recount to their friends their visit to the most revered and sacred place in the entire civilized world. Often, one of the temple servants would act as a guide for these esteemed visitors, accompanying them through the sacred precinct and revealing the historical significance of each structure and monument. This duty brought him sincere pleasure, as it offered a unique opportunity to view Delphi with fresh eyes, realizing anew how striking and magnificent this place must appear to those who were not its daily inhabitants. Thus, for example, he might explain to a well-dressed merchant from Rhodes, pointing to a small but exquisite treasury, this structure was erected in honor of the triumphant victory at Marathon. The Athenians sought to express their profound gratitude to Apollo for his assistance in defeating the Persian invaders, dedicating 1/10 of all war spoils to him. The merchant, in turn, nodded appreciatively. Like most Hellenes, he was, of course, familiar with the legendary story of Marathon. However, seeing the authentic treasury, where perhaps Persian gold and silver were stored, the famous battle gained tangible reality for him, becoming not just a story, but a living testament to history. The servant continued the tour, showing the merchant the famous tripods awarded to victorious athletes of the Pythian Games, a grand festival in honor of Apollo, which every 4 years brought together participants from all corners of the Mediterranean. He pointed to the majestic statue of Gelon of Syracuse, erected at his behest after a glorious victory over the Carthaginians. The guide also explained in detail how the sacred way leading to the temple was designed to create in the pilgrim a sense of gradual ascent to the divine. Each new turn on this path revealed new architectural wonders and monuments, while simultaneously building up a reverent anticipation of encountering the temple, which crowned the very summit of the mountain. The merchant showed keen interest, asking thoughtful questions. He wanted to know how priests were selected, how the oracle's mysterious prophecies were recorded, and whether ordinary mortals like himself could request consultations with Apollo. The servant answered as fully as possible, though he admitted that some aspects of the oracle's functioning remained hidden from all but the highest-ranking priests. However, he could enthusiastically recount what it was like to live in this sacred place daily. He described how the morning glow illuminating the marble columns never grew old, never became mundane. How the melodious sounds of hymns echoing through the mountain peaks imbued even the most mundane duties with deep meaning, and how the continuous stream of pilgrims flocking here from all corners of the known world created the feeling that Delphi was truly the center of the universe, the only place where all the disparate threads of human experience intertwined. As the day inexorably drew to a close, the mountain peaks began to cast their long, winding shadows across the sacred precinct. Travellers, having completed their visits, gradually descended the mountain to seek shelter for the night in the town below. Meanwhile, the temple servants, having finished their daily duties, gathered for their evening meal in the communal dining hall, comfortably situated on the hillside just below the temple. The food was simple yet hearty: bread baked fresh each morning, fragrant cheese made from the milk of goats grazing on the mountain slopes, succulent olives, and golden olive oil. Wine, diluted with water according to ancient Greek custom, completed the table. Meat from the morning sacrifice, cooked over a fragrant wood fire, was also served, along with an abundance of fresh fruits and vegetables brought from the fertile valleys. However, the true nourishment, surpassing the physical, stemmed from the lively conversations held at the long wooden tables. Priests, scribes, and skilled artisans exchanged impressions and events of the day gone by. One might mention a particularly beautiful offering that arrived from distant Egypt. Another would detail a problem with one of the treasury roofs, requiring immediate repair before the winter rains. A young priest enthusiastically recounted his research into ancient prophecies, seeking to identify hidden patterns in Apollo's divine guidance that had been traced over many centuries. Communication was never rushed or tense. There was something special about a life dedicated to service in a sacred place that made people more thoughtful, more tolerant of one another. Disagreements were resolved quickly and always fairly. Rumours, if they arose, were gentle and good-natured. Everyone understood that they were an integral part of something much larger than themselves, something that would continue to exist long after they had left this world. When complete, impenetrable darkness descended upon the mountain, oil lamps flickered to life throughout the sacred precinct. The columns of the majestic temple softly gleamed in their light, creating islands of warm, subdued radiance amidst the surrounding night mist. The characteristic sounds of the night began to emerge. The distant bark of a fox, the gentle hoot of an owl, the whisper of the wind sweeping through the wild laurel trees on the mountainside. One of the servants made a final round of the treasury, carefully checking the lock. locks and ensuring all valuables were securely protected for the night. Then he ascended back up the hillside to his humble stone dwelling, carrying an oil lamp that lit his way along the familiar path. Before falling asleep, the servant often stepped outside to gaze at the starry sky. Here on the mountain top, the stars seemed extraordinarily close, shining brighter and in unimaginable multitudes than ever in the valleys below. On particularly clear and still nights, one could almost imagine hearing music from the celestial spheres. Perhaps Apollo's own lyre played melodies too wondrous and sublime for mortal ears. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new daily concerns, another stream of visitors and pilgrims, another opportunity to serve the god who had chosen this mountain as the most sacred place in the ancient world. But this night, as he drifted into sleep, he felt a deep, pervasive satisfaction that comes from meaningful work, the awareness of being part of something eternal and exceptionally important. Sometimes, in her dreams, she could hear the voice of the Oracle herself, the mysterious priestess who spoke on behalf of Apollo. When the gods favoured unveiling the future to mortal minds, her words were always deeply wise and undeniably truthful, though their true meaning was not always immediately obvious. Her personal name never appeared in any official temple documents. No Pythia throughout history was mentioned by name in the sacred annals. They were known simply as Pythias, women who served as Apollo's voice, whose individual identity completely dissolved into their divine function. However, to do justice to her significance, let us call this priestess Clio, after the muse of history, for her life's journey is undoubtedly worthy of being immortalized, even if her true name has been lost to the sands of time. Clio was chosen for the role of Pythia when she was already over 50. Her hair was already touched with noble grey, and her face was etched with fine wrinkles, testifying to decades of accumulated wisdom and rich life experience. This choice was not accidental. Over many centuries of service, Apollo's priests had become firmly convinced that young women, no matter how sharp their minds or spiritual gifts, very rarely possessed the inner fortitude and unshakable stability that were absolutely essential to become the voice of the god himself. To be an oracle meant not merely to receive divine inspiration, it required the ability to withstand the overwhelming power of the deity's presence while maintaining clarity of mind and one's own sense of self, serving only as a pure channel for the transmission of sacred knowledge. Such a mission demanded the deep, unwavering serenity of spirit that, as a rule, comes only with age and accumulated experience. Clio was born in an unremarkable village nestled in the foothills of Delphi, the daughter of a simple potter who skillfully crafted plain clay vessels for local farmers and shepherds. In her youth, she married a blacksmith and raised 4 children. 2 of them, sadly, she had to mourn in infancy, a tragically common occurrence in the realities of the ancient world, and 2 others she happily saw grow up and start their own families. In her lifetime, she experienced a succession of wars and periods of famine, times of abundant harvests and years of hardship, and knew the ordinary joys and sorrows that, in essence, make up the lives of most people. She turned to Apollo with sincere prayers in difficult times and offered him thanks in years of prosperity. Many times over the years she made the ascent up the mountain path to Delphi, sometimes to seek divine guidance, and sometimes simply to participate in the many festivals that united the entire region in common rejoicing and worship. For many years the priests watched this woman closely, unbeknownst to her. Her ability to be a focal point for her fellow citizens when they sought wise counsel amidst community disagreements caught their attention. They noted her composure and deep thoughtfulness, demonstrated even in the most tense, crisis-ridden moments. Her genuine, unostentatious piety, not the showy religious fervour that craves striking signs and miracles, but a deep, unwavering faith, silently trusting in the higher wisdom of the deity, even when its paths seemed incomprehensible, elicited particular admiration. When the preceding Pythia, having reached the venerable age of 73, peacefully passed away forever, the priests spent long months in prayer and deliberation, seeking guidance from Apollo himself as to who would inherit her sacred office. And the divine answer came to them in the form of dreams and omens, each of which unequivocally pointed to the potter's daughter from the village below. Accepting this sacred mission evoked mixed feelings in Clio. She was deeply honoured, but at the same time overwhelmed with anxiety, feeling utterly unprepared for the colossal demands her new life would place upon her. The first stage was a cycle of thorough purification rituals. For 30 days she resided in a special dwelling within the sacred precinct, adhering to a strict diet. Only bread, cheese, pure water, and a moderate amount of diluted wine constituted her meagre sustenance. Daily she performed ablutions in the waters of the sacred Castalian spring, cleansing herself not only of bodily impurities but also of all attachments and worldly concerns that had accumulated during her ordinary life. The priests initiated her into the mysteries of ancient hymns and prayers, passed down from one Pythia to another through countless generations. Some of these chants were so archaic that their language could barely be identified as Greek. Yet their melodies possessed an extraordinary power, capable of altering states of consciousness, preparing the mind for direct contact with the divine. Over time she mastered the art of discerning the sacred signs that heralded Apollo's readiness to utter his prophecies through her. This could be a barely perceptible rustle of laurel leaves in perfectly still air, or a unique pattern of vapour rising from the depths of the sacred spring on certain days, and sometimes a particular quality of light that seemed to condense around the inner sanctum of the temple, signalling the deity's presence. But the most important of all lessons was the ability to completely detach from her own will, to cast aside personal thoughts, desires, and judgments, to become a kind of empty vessel, ready to be filled with divine knowledge. This proved to be the most difficult test. Clio had lived for half a century, forming her individuality, honing her own approach to problem-solving and decision-making. Now she had to learn to put all of that aside, becoming utterly receptive to whatever Apollo wished to convey through her. When the first day of her service as Oracle arrived, Clio was so deeply moved that she could barely take a few steps from the temple entrance to the sacred tripod upon which she was to sit to receive divine inspiration. Her hands visibly trembled as she adjusted the folds of her pristine white robes. Her voice treacherously cracked as she uttered the opening prayers. The pilgrim who had come for advice was a middle-aged farmer from Boeotia. His question was painfully simple. His wife had been childless for 15 years of their marriage, and he desperately wished to know if Apollo could show him the path to progeny. Clio sat down on the 3-legged bronze seat and closed her eyes. She breathed deeply and deliberately, seeking to calm her racing heart and open her mind to perceive the divine presence. For a long time, absolutely nothing happened. Panic seized her, agonizing doubts tormented her. Had Apollo made a mistake in his choice? Would she fail at the most crucial moment of her new destiny? And then, quite suddenly, the deity appeared. It did not feel like possession by an alien spirit, as some ancient authors sometimes described. Rather, it was like a transformation, a becoming something far greater than herself, as if her consciousness had expanded immeasurably to encompass knowledge and perspectives that no mortal mind could ordinarily grasp. In that moment, she felt the farmer's profound love for his wife, his growing despair, how the long years of childlessness had cast a shadow over their entire marriage. But beyond that, she also saw deeper patterns of his existence, extending beyond the superficial question. With divine clarity, it was revealed to her that his wife's barrenness was neither a curse nor a punishment, but merely one of those inexplicable sorrows that sometimes touch human destinies. And she also clearly saw that a child awaited them, not one born of his wife's body, but one already existing in the world, needing parents capable of showering it with love. When Clio finally spoke, her voice sounded different even to her own ears. It was deeper, more resonant, imbued with absolute, unwavering certainty. The child you seek is not the one you expect. Look beyond your own blood, and you will find a son who has been waiting for your love. The farmer left the sanctuary, bewildered, yet at the same time filled with new hope. 3 months later, he returned to offer thanks to Apollo. A plague that had struck a neighbouring village had left many children orphaned. He and his wife adopted a 7-year-old boy whose parents had passed away, and from the moment they brought him into their home, their dwelling was filled with the joy they had sought in vain for many years. News of the successful prophecy spread rapidly throughout the region, as it always did when the oracle's wise guidance proved not only accurate, but also tangibly beneficial. As more and more pilgrims flocked to Delphi, bringing with them questions both profound and mundane. A young man inquired which path he should choose, that of a warrior or a merchant. Clio, speaking with Apollo's voice, answered him that his greatest triumphs would be achieved not on the battlefield nor in trade routes, but through the power of words. He subsequently became one of Athens' most celebrated orators. Representatives of one city asked about the advisability of founding a new colony overseas. The oracle instructed them to seek a place where Apollo's ravens gathered in unusually numerous flocks. Such a place was found on the coast of modern-day Turkey, and a thriving trading port was established there. A mother brought her sick child, asking if the fever would subside. Apollo's answer was circuitous and metaphorical. The tree that bends in the storm survives, while the rigid oak falls. The woman interpreted this as an instruction to stop force-feeding the child, and instead allow its body to rest and recover naturally. The fever receded within a few days. As months passed, Clio became more deeply immersed in her role as a herald of the divine will. She learned to unconditionally trust the flow of divine knowledge passing through her, even when it ran counter to her own human understanding of circumstances. She developed special methods to cope with the intensity of the spiritual experience associated with transmitting Apollo's consciousness. These included breathing exercises, meditative practices, and other ways of preparing her mind and body for the all-encompassing presence of divine wisdom. However, She also came to understand that being an oracle meant more than simply receiving messages from the deity. It also required the ability to translate these messages into a language that ordinary mortals could comprehend and apply in their lives. Apollo's omniscience was boundless and timeless. He foresaw all potential possibilities, all consequences, all interconnected patterns that shaped human destiny. But the human mind thinks linearly, operating with concrete images, constructing stories with clear beginnings and ends. Therefore, Clio had to master the role not only of a conduit, but also of a skilled interpreter. When Apollo revealed to her colossal, multifaceted truths about someone's future, she had to find ways to condense this knowledge into concise and memorable phrases that would guide the questioner towards making wise decisions. Sometimes this meant uttering prophecies in the form of riddles and metaphors, requiring deep contemplation for full understanding. The most famous prophecies in the annals of history were often enigmatic, not because Apollo had a penchant for mystery, but because some truths are too grand and complex for direct transmission. When King Croesus asked whether he should launch a military campaign against the Persian Empire, Apollo revealed a vision to Clio, countless armies clashing in furious battle, cities engulfed in flames, an ancient kingdom reduced to ruins. However, the deity also showed her that the question itself was fundamentally flawed. Croesus was inquiring about military strategy, whereas he should have been asking about wisdom, justice, and the proper use of the power granted to him. That is why the oracle's famous answer was, "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great kingdom." Croesus, guided by his own ambitions, mistakenly interpreted this as a prediction of the impending destruction of the Persian Empire. Only after a crushing defeat did he realize the true meaning. The great kingdom he had doomed was his own. The prophecy proved absolutely accurate, but it also served as a harsh lesson in humility, reminding that even rulers must meticulously consider their assumptions and hidden motives before taking actions that can affect the destinies of thousands of people. Life as an oracle inevitably entailed a deep, almost sacred solitude. Clio was not allowed to casually mention what she saw when Apollo's consciousness passed through her. She was strictly forbidden from using divine knowledge for her own benefit or to assist her family and friends. She had to maintain absolute neutrality, impeccable fairness, treating the concerns of powerful kings and simple peasants with equal reverence and attention. Her longtime friends from the village below found it extremely difficult to reconcile themselves with her new, elevated role. How could one engage in ordinary conversation with someone who spoke on behalf of the deity itself? How could one complain about the weather or gossip about neighbours with a woman who had access to unfathomable divine wisdom? Therefore, Clio's closest and most trusted relationships were forged with other temple servants, the priests who meticulously prepared her for each oracular session, the scribes who scrupulously recorded her prophecies, and the attendants who maintained the purity and sanctity of the space where she performed her duties. They deeply understood the heavy burden she carried. They witnessed her utter exhaustion after each contact with the divine, how it sometimes took her days to recover from the colossal spiritual intensity of transmitting divine consciousness. They respectfully accommodated her solitude and need for silence, yet surrounded her with care and unwavering support. The oracle's quiet life and divine perspective. On days when Clio was not performing her duties as oracle, which was most of the time, Since prophecies were given only once a month, her life unfolded in seclusion within the sacred precinct of the temple. She devoted herself to tending a small garden where she grew various herbs necessary for temple rituals. Her hands were also occupied with spinning wool and weaving fabrics, meeting the daily needs of the sanctuary. In addition, Clio deeply studied the records of past prophecies, seeking to uncover hidden patterns that might help her more profoundly understand Apollo's unique ways of communicating with mortals. Sometimes in the pre-dawn hours before the temple filled with the bustle of daily activities, she would sit on the steps of Apollo's majestic temple, gazing at the valley spread out below. From this elevation, her gaze encompassed a vast expanse for miles in every direction: olive groves and vineyards, cozy villages, thin wisps of smoke from fires, and in the distance, beyond a ridge of mountains, the shimmering gleam of the sea. This landscape involuntarily reminded her of the divine perspective, of how Apollo could see all human life unfurled before him, like a vast, intricate tapestry. Individual human destinies appeared as mere threads in this grand fabric, important to be sure, yet still part of something far grander and more complex than any mortal could fully comprehend. In these silent moments, Clio sometimes felt the god's presence, even when she was not formally serving as his oracle. It was not the overwhelming, transformative experience of prophecy, but rather a gentle awareness of divine wisdom permeating the world. She felt Apollo's deep love for humanity, his sincere desire to help people make decisions that would lead to prosperity and happiness. She understood, in a way she could never fully explain to others, that Apollo's prophecies were not arbitrary pronouncements of a predetermined future. They were guidance based on the natural consequences of human choices. It was wisdom designed to help people align their actions with the deeper patterns of justice and harmony that govern the universe. The oracle's service, divine counseling. Thus, the oracle's service was not fortune-telling in the sense we might imagine it today. It was more akin to spiritual counseling, conducted at the highest possible level. It was divine wisdom applied to human problems, infinite knowledge filtered through the prism of perfect compassion. Years passed unnoticed, and Clio's hair turned completely white. Wrinkles deepened around her eyes, but they were wrinkles born of wisdom and serenity, not of worry or sorrow. In her role, she found a peace she had never experienced in her former life, a sense of complete alignment with her true purpose. Each month, new pilgrims arrived, bringing the same questions people had asked for centuries. Will I be happy? Will I be successful? Should I marry this person? Should I move to this place? How do I know what the gods want me to do? And month after month, Clio opened herself to Apollo's wisdom and uttered answers that guided these seekers toward better choices, deeper understanding, more fulfilling lives. In her ordinary human consciousness, she never knew if the advice she gave in Apollo's voice was truly helpful. Pilgrims left Delphi immediately after receiving their prophecies, returning to their distant homes to ponder the meaning of the god's words through their own life experiences. Sometimes, however, years later, someone would return to Delphi to offer a thank offering to Apollo. This might be a successful merchant who had started his business based on the oracle's guidance, or a happy wife who had chosen a husband in accordance with divine advice, or a city that had averted disaster by heeding the god's warnings. These return visits were the greatest joy in Clio's life as Pythia. They confirmed what she had always believed but could never prove, that Apollo's love for humanity was real, that divine wisdom truly could help mortals navigate the complexities of earthly life, and that her own role as the voice of the god was truly meaningful. Legacy and the last prophecy. But even more important than successful prophecies were the lessons she learned about the nature of divine guidance itself. Apollo never made choices for people. He never guaranteed easy or comfortable outcomes. Instead, he helped people to more clearly understand their options, to more accurately see the likely consequences of their actions, and to align their decisions with principles of wisdom and justice that would serve them well, regardless of external circumstances. The god, speaking through Clio's voice, taught people to ask better questions, rather than simply giving them the answers they thought they wanted. He encouraged them to think more deeply about their motives and values. He helped them to develop the kind of inner wisdom that would serve them throughout their lives, not just in the immediate situation that brought them to Delphi. And slowly, over her years of service as Oracle, Clio came to understand that this was how divine guidance was meant to work, not as a magical solution to human problems, but as a way of helping people become wiser, more thoughtful, more capable of making choices that would lead to genuine happiness and fulfillment. When she turned 70, Clio felt Apollo's presence begin to recede from her. It was not sudden, but gradual, like a slow ebbing tide. She knew her time as Oracle was coming to an end, and she was ready for this transition. Her last prophecy was given to a young woman who asked a question Clio herself might have asked decades earlier: how can I live a life that matters? Apollo's answer, spoken through the aging Pythia's voice, was simple and profound. Listen deeply, speak truthfully, choose wisely, love fiercely. The gods ask no more. 3 months later, Clio peacefully passed away in her sleep, just like her predecessor. The priests found her in her small cell within the temple precinct, her face serene, her hands folded over a scroll containing one of Apollo's ancient hymns. She was buried with honors in the sacred cemetery on the mountainside above Delphi, her grave marked by a simple stone that identified her only as a Pythia, faithful servant of Apollo. Her personal name was never recorded, as she had wished, but her legacy lived on in the wisdom she imparted, in the guidance she gave, in the lives she helped improve, through her service as the voice of the god. And in the quiet moments before dawn, when the mountain mist swirled around the temple columns, and the first light touched the sacred peaks, the priests sometimes imagined they could still hear her voice, deep and resonant with divine authority, speaking truths that would live long after marble crumbled and bronze turned green. Pilgrims in search of wisdom. But who were these people who ascended this mountain in search of such wisdom? What drove ordinary mortals to undertake the arduous journey to Apollo's sacred sanctuary? Let us follow some of them along the winding path and listen to the questions that weighed so heavily on their hearts. The messenger arrived in Delphi 3 days before King Croesus himself, bearing gifts so magnificent that even Apollo's priests, men accustomed to receiving offerings from the wealthiest individuals in the ancient world, ceased their daily duties to stare in astonishment. First came a golden lion, life-sized and perfectly crafted. Its mane was worked with such skill that each strand seemed to catch the morning light. The lion weighed almost 500 pounds of pure gold, and it took 12 men to carry it up the sacred way to Apollo's temple. Then followed mixing bowls of gold and silver, each large enough for a person to bathe in, their surfaces adorned with intricate scenes of gods and heroes. There were golden cups and silver amphorae, bronze tripods with serpent-shaped legs, ivory sculptures carved by the greatest artists of the age, but the most impressive gift was a golden altar, solid and intended as a permanent addition to Apollo's temple. The altar was inscribed with prayers in several languages and adorned with precious stones gathered from the most distant corners of the known world. The priests meticulously catalogued each item, recording its weight, dimensions and artistic details in the permanent temple records. But they also whispered among themselves about what these extraordinary gifts might signify. In their many years of experience, the most lavish offerings usually preceded the most desperate questions. They were right. When King Croesus of Lydia finally arrived in Delphi, accompanied by a retinue of nobles, servants, and guards, his question was simple, yet fraught with consequences that would change the ancient world. Should I wage war against the Persian Empire? To understand why this question was so important, one must envision the political situation in the ancient world around 550 BC. For centuries, the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had been relatively stable. Greek city-states controlled the islands and coastal areas. Various kingdoms, such as Lydia, ruled the inland regions of modern-day Turkey. Egypt dominated the south, and far to the east, the Persian Empire was growing ever larger and more powerful, but had not yet seriously turned its attention to conquering the west. The ruler of Lydia, King Croesus, exercised his power from the majestic capital of Sardis, located in what is now western Turkey. The Lydian kingdom was renowned for its immense wealth, so great that even today the expression "as rich as Croesus" serves to describe a person with virtually limitless financial resources. This prosperous state controlled vital trade routes connecting Europe and Asia, and its rivers abounded with gold, which Lydian artisans transformed into works of art with unparalleled skill. However, as Croesus gradually realized, abundance could be not only a gift, but also a heavy burden. The more significant and successful his kingdom became, the more it attracted the gaze of greedy neighbors eager to seize Lydia's untold treasures. At the same time, the mighty Persian Empire, led by its energetic and young ruler Cyrus, was steadily advancing westward. Media and Babylon had already been conquered, and their riches, as well as their armies, had been integrated into Persia's rapidly growing power. Now Persian outposts began appearing on Lydia's eastern borders, and diplomatic notes arriving from the Persian court grew increasingly ultimatum in nature. Croesus faced a truly terrifying dilemma. If he waited for Persia to launch the first aggression, he would have to fight a defensive battle on his own land, which would inevitably lead to devastation for his people and cities. However, if he himself launched an offensive, he would initiate a war against an adversary whose true strength remained unknown, risking the fate of his entire kingdom on a single military campaign. Either path could lead to inevitable disaster. Stymied, Croesus decided to follow the example of the powerful Greeks, who for generations had turned to divine providence in search of solutions to intractable problems. He intended to seek Apollo's counsel. However, Croesus was not only incredibly wealthy, but also exceptionally cautious. Before entrusting the future of his state to the oracle's predictions, he deemed it necessary to verify the veracity of the divine prophecy. To this end he dispatched messengers to 7 different oracles scattered throughout the ancient world, to the famous Delphi, to ancient Dodona, to the Oracle of Ammon in distant Libya, and to several other sacred sites. The envoys were strictly instructed to ask each oracle the same question on the same day. What exactly is King Croesus doing at this very moment? Meanwhile, Croesus himself spent that momentous day performing an action so unusual and peculiar that no mortal mind could have grasped his intent. He took a young lamb and a tortoise, meticulously cut them into pieces, and then boiled them together in a bronze cauldron, covered with a matching bronze lid, in a secluded corner of his private courtyard, hidden from prying eyes. When the messengers returned with answers from the numerous oracles, only one of them managed to accurately describe Croesus's bizarre actions. The oracle at Delphi, speaking through Apollo's priestess, declared, "I count the grains of sand on the seashore and measure the expanses of the ocean. I comprehend the speech of the mute and hear the silent. To my senses came a scent. A hard-shelled tortoise boils and bubbles with lamb's flesh in a bronze cauldron, where bronze serves as the bottom and bronze as the lid that covers it." The astonishing accuracy of this prediction utterly convinced Croesus that Apollo truly possessed the ability to see across vast distances and fathom hidden secrets inaccessible to mortal eyes. Encouraged by this, he sent his lavish, magnificent gifts to Delphi and prepared to ask the crucial question upon which the future of his prosperous kingdom depended. The oracle's answer, when finally received, was surprisingly reassuring. If Croesus crosses the Halys River, he will destroy a great kingdom. The Halys River, as is well known, served as the natural boundary between Lydia and the Persian Empire. Croesus interpreted this prophecy as an unambiguous indication that, should he invade Persian territory, he would crush Cyrus's mighty kingdom and thereby forever secure Lydia. However, it must be remembered that Apollo's prophecies were always renowned for their duality and required very careful interpretation. The deity's words were invariably technically accurate, but their meaning did not always align with what listeners sought or expected to hear. Encouraged by what he perceived as unambiguous divine approval of his belligerent designs, Croesus embarked on the grand preparation of the largest military campaign in Lydia's history. He forged strategic alliances with Sparta and Egypt, thereby ensuring that Persia would have to fight on several fronts simultaneously. To bolster his own troops, he hired thousands of mercenary warriors. Spurning no expense, Croesus amassed weaponry, provisions and siege engines, striving to equip his forces in the best possible manner. The grandiose preparations for war took almost a full year. Throughout this period, messengers tirelessly shuttled between Sardis and the capitals of Croesus's allied states, meticulously coordinating the overall strategy and timing of the impending actions. Lydian gold flowed inexhaustibly, paying for ships and legions of soldiers, horses and chariots, and also ensuring the gigantic logistical operation necessary to transport and supply a vast army in enemy territory. Finally, in the spring of 547 BC, Croesus, at the head of his troops, crossed the Halys River, stepping onto Persian lands. Initially, the campaign developed quite successfully. Lydian detachments captured several border towns and won a number of minor victories over Persian vanguards. For several weeks it seemed that Apollo's prophecy was being fulfilled exactly as Croesus wished and expected. However, soon King Cyrus himself arrived on the battlefield at the head of the main Persian army. The two mighty forces clashed in a grandiose confrontation on the plain near the ancient city of Thira, located in modern-day central Turkey. The battle was fierce, bloody, and lasted all day, inflicting enormous losses on both sides. When dusk finally descended upon the battlefield, neither army had achieved a decisive victory. Croesus, realizing that the Persians were far more formidable than he had anticipated, decided to retreat to Sardis for winter quarters. His strategic plan was to use the cold months to attract new allies and gather reinforcements, and then resume the military campaign in the spring, when weather conditions would be more favorable. This was, without doubt, a sensible strategy, the kind of carefully thought-out military planning that had ensured Lydia's success and prosperity for many years. However, Croesus made a fatal mistake, severely underestimating his adversary. Instead of, like most armies of the ancient world, retreating to winter quarters, Cyrus, with ruthless speed and astonishing efficiency, continued to pursue the retreating Lydians. The Persian army reached the walls of Sardis just as Croesus was beginning to organize the city's defenses. The siege began immediately, and within 14 days Persian warriors managed to find a way to overcome the seemingly impregnable walls of the Lydian capital. King Croesus was captured in his own palace. His great army was either completely destroyed or scattered. Centuries of wealth, accumulated over generations, were loaded onto Persian wagons, and the Lydian kingdom, once one of the richest and most powerful states of the ancient world, ceased to exist. Apollo's prophecy was fulfilled with truly devastating accuracy. Croesus did indeed cross the Halys River, and he did indeed destroy a great kingdom, but the great kingdom he brought to ruin turned out to be his own. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who recorded this story about half a century after its events, Croesus was initially condemned to be burned alive, destined as a sacrifice to the Persian gods. However, as he stood on the funeral pyre, waiting for the flames to ignite, another piece of wisdom he had once received from a distinguished Greek philosopher came to mind. Long before the war began, a wise man named Solon had visited Croesus's court. The king, with unconcealed pride, showcased all his immense wealth and boundless power to his guest. He then asked Solon who, in his opinion, was the happiest man in the world. Croesus obviously expected to be named the happiest. However, Solon replied that no one can be called truly happy until their life's journey is complete. For fortune, like a fickle wind, can turn at any moment. Even the wealthiest and most powerful person risks encountering unimaginable catastrophe before their demise, and only a life that has ended well can be truly deemed successful. Standing on the Persian pyre, face to face with his imminent death, Croesus finally grasped the profound meaning of what Solon had tried to teach him. He thrice cried out the philosopher's name in despair, Solon, Solon, Solon. Cyrus, hearing these cries, demanded an explanation. When Croesus recounted Solon's wisdom to him, the Persian king was so struck by what he heard that he immediately ordered the execution to be halted. Instead of putting his defeated enemy to death, Cyrus made Croesus one of his trusted advisors, greatly valuing the fallen king's hard-won understanding of the inconstancy and capriciousness of fate. However, Croesus had not yet concluded his relationship with Apollo. As soon as he settled at Cyrus's court and managed to regain a certain influence, he dispatched another embassy to Delphi. This time, instead of lavish gifts, he conveyed a bitter complaint. How could Apollo have so cruelly deceived him? How could the god accept his magnificent offerings and then give him advice that ultimately led to the complete annihilation of his kingdom? The oracle's reply was, as always, profound in meaning and quite unsympathetic in tone. Apollo saved Croesus from the fate he justly deserved. By his mercy, the god delayed this fate for a full 3 years. However, Croesus failed to realize this. Moreover, Croesus asked an entirely wrong question. He should have asked whether he should start a war at all, not merely whether he should wage war specifically against Persia. And if he had doubts about the true meaning of the prophecy, he should have sent messengers to request clarification. In other words, Apollo provided Croesus with exactly what he asked for, highly accurate information about the potential consequences of his intended course of action. However, the deity was not responsible for Croesus's own assumptions. His inability to ask additional clarifying questions, or his tendency to interpret divine guidance in a way that merely confirmed his already formed desires instead of questioning them. The story of Croesus became one of the most famous cautionary tales in the ancient world. It was told and retold from generation to generation as a vivid example of how even celestial wisdom can be misinterpreted by mortals who approach it with preconceived notions and false expectations. This ancient story of Croesus also vividly demonstrates the true mechanism of the Delphic oracle. The predictions emanating from Apollo were not intended to make vital decisions for people or to guarantee them inevitable success. On the contrary, their purpose was to prompt the questioners to a clearer and deeper understanding of their own choices and the hidden motives behind them. Had Croesus approached the oracle with true openness to divine guidance, had he been willing to consider the possibility that military confrontation might not be the optimal solution to his problems, then Apollo's enigmatic message could have spurred him to seek diplomatic avenues, to develop creative solutions capable of preserving both his own kingdom and regional peace. However, Croesus arrived in Delphi with a firm and preconceived decision. He sought not genuine guidance regarding the wisdom of his choice, but merely divine approval for a course of action he had already decided upon. That is why Apollo sent him a prophecy that, while technically accurate, nevertheless did not prevent him from making the mistake the king was determined to commit. The deity valued human free will too highly to override it, even foreseeing that someone's choice might lead to catastrophic consequences. This profound understanding of the essence of divine guidance, that it is meant to illuminate options and their potential consequences, not to control outcomes, became the cornerstone of the oracle's activity throughout its many centuries of history. Both kings and common people alike learned that Apollo's wisdom was most beneficial to those who approached it with genuine humility and a willingness to accept even the most unexpected answers. The narrative of Croesus also solidified Delphi's reputation as a center for political prophecies. News spread throughout the ancient world that Apollo could foresee the rise and fall of kingdoms, the outcomes of great wars, and the long-term consequences of political decisions. This unparalleled reputation attracted more and more rulers to Delphi in search of divine guidance, transforming the oracle into one of the most influential institutions in ancient political life. But not all royal consultations ended in tragedy. Many monarchs, both men and women, learned to ask more insightful questions than Croesus, approaching divine wisdom with the humility and careful deliberation that such counsel demanded. The oracle guided the founding of colonies, facilitated alliances, aided in establishing laws, and influenced countless other political decisions that shaped the development of Greek civilization. And in most cases, rulers who followed Apollo's guidance with true wisdom and flexibility found that it led them to justice, prosperity, and the kind of success that could withstand the inevitable vicissitudes of fate. However, the influence of the Delphic oracle extended far beyond the decisions made by kings and queens. Ordinary people, farmers and merchants, soldiers and artisans also ascended the winding mountain path to Delphi, carrying their own questions and their own hopes for divine guidance. Their stories, perhaps less dramatic than the fall of entire kingdoms, were no less significant to those who lived them. The old farmer's hands tremble slightly as he carefully unwraps his offering. It is a small bronze bull figurine, no larger than his thumb. It was meticulously crafted by the village blacksmith and polished to a sheen, so that it appeared golden in the dim light of the temple. This figurine represents months of painstaking savings, coins set aside from the sale of barley and olives, copper pieces accumulated through the strictest economy on everything from lamp oil to winter clothing. His name is Apollodorus, meaning gift of Apollo, and he has walked for 4 days from his small farm in Boeotia to reach this sacred mountain. His feet are blistered. His simple wool tunic is dusty from the long road. He carries the scent of honest labour, earth and sweat, and the faint but persistent aroma of the barn where he tends his few animals. He looks remarkably out of place among the majestic marble columns and golden treasuries. This weathered man, whose hands are perpetually stained with earth and whose vocabulary contains more words for different kinds of fertilizer than for abstract philosophical concepts. Yet, Apollo's priests treat him with the same respectful attention as they would kings or wealthy merchants, for the oracle makes no distinction between rich and poor when it comes to human needs. Apollodorus's question is simple, but it presses upon him like a heavy stone on his chest. His youngest son, barely 16, has expressed a desire to leave the farm and seek his fortune in Athens. The boy is clever and ambitious, chafing at the quiet rhythm of agricultural life, dreaming of becoming a merchant or perhaps even a politician in the great city. But if the son leaves, who will help with the harvest? Who will take care of Apollodorus and his wife when they are too old to work? The farm has belonged to their family for 5 generations, and must it die with them because their son seeks a different life? The farmer has spent sleepless nights agonizing over this dilemma. He loves his son and wishes him happiness, but he also fears losing everything his ancestors built. He fears spending his final years in poverty because he was too generous to withhold the help he desperately needed. When Apollodorus finally kneels before the Pythia and whispers his question, his voice breaks with emotion. Should I let my son go to Athens, or should I keep him on the farm where he belongs? The oracle's answer comes in the form of a gentle riddle. A seed that remains in the granary never grows, but a seed that falls on stony ground quickly dies. Seek the middle path, a field that is neither too safe nor too dangerous. Apollodorus leaves Delphi more confused than enlightened. What does Apollo mean by a middle path? How can there be a compromise between staying and leaving? But as he walks home, pondering the god's words deeply, understanding slowly dawns. Perhaps he doesn't have to choose between keeping his son forever and losing him completely. Perhaps there is a way for the boy to explore opportunities in Athens while still maintaining a strong connection to the family farm. When Apollodorus returns home, he proposes a thoughtful plan to his son. The boy can spend the winter months in Athens learning about trade and city life, working for one of their distant cousins who owns a small business there. But he will return each spring for planting and each autumn for harvest, bringing his city knowledge to help improve the farm's operations. It was not the complete freedom the boy dreamed of, nor the absolute security the father hoped for, but it was a solution that worked. The son gains valuable skills in Athens and eventually starts a business importing wine into the city, while also introducing new agricultural methods to the family farm. As a result, both father and son prosper, and the farm continues into the next generation, enriched rather than abandoned. Apollo's guidance helped them find a creative solution neither could have imagined on their own. Not far behind Apollodorus on the mountain path follows a young warrior named Lysander. His bronze armor is polished, but already bears the marks of dents from his first campaign. He is barely 20 years old, and there is a nervous energy about him that comes from surviving battles where many of his comrades fell. Lysander fought at Marathon 5 years ago, standing in the phalanx when the Greeks won their improbable victory against the invading Persians. He experienced the euphoria of triumph, the pride of serving his city flawlessly, the deep satisfaction of protecting all he loved from foreign domination. But he also saw things that now haunt his dreams. The moment his best friend took a Persian spear to the chest and died, calling for his mother. The aftermath of battle when Greek soldiers wandered among the wounded enemy, deciding who would live and who would die. The way victory celebrations felt hollow when remembering the faces of the men who would not be returning home. Now Athens is planning another military campaign, this time against its former allies in the Delian League, who have ceased paying the tribute that funds the Athenian fleet. Lysander has been selected for promotion to a leadership position, an honor most young men would celebrate with enthusiasm. However, Lysander is not sure he wants to spend his entire life as a soldier. The glory of war seems less significant now than when he was 18 and had never seen blood on his hands. He has begun to ponder other ways to serve his city, perhaps as a teacher, or working in the administration of the growing Athenian empire, or even as a merchant whose profits could support public works and festivals. His question to the oracle is deeply personal. I have served as a soldier, but war has shown me things I wish to forget. Should I continue military service, or should I seek another path? The Pythia's answer, as always, is layered. A sword that is never drawn rusts, but a sword that is always drawn dulls. Honor requires both strength and wisdom. Serve your city in a way that preserves what you protect. Lysander ponders these words for days. What does it mean to serve in a way that preserves what you protect? How can he honor his military experience while also honoring his growing understanding that violence should be a last resort, not a first choice? Eventually he finds his answer in an unexpected place. Athens needs experienced soldiers to train the city's youth in military skills, but it also needs teachers who can help young men understand the moral responsibilities that come with the ability to wield violence. Lysander becomes an instructor in the gymnasium, teaching not only the techniques of weapons and battlefield tactics, but also the philosophical principles that should guide a warrior's decisions. His students learn to fight effectively, but they also learn to carefully consider when battle is necessary and when it is not. They develop the physical courage to face enemies in battle, but also the moral courage to question orders that might bring dishonor to their city. Many years later, when these students grow up and occupy key positions in the Athenian military leadership, their actions demonstrate not only bravery, but also deep strategic understanding. Their generalship manifests in their ability to more effectively prevail in inevitable conflicts and to more prudently avoid those that lack compelling justification. Thus, Apollo's wisdom, reinterpreted through Lysander's extensive experience and guidance, left its profound mark on Athens's entire military strategy, shaping its course for a whole generation. Following them arrives a middle-aged woman named Penelope, accompanied by her young daughter Melanippe. Their attire, though modest, was well made, unequivocally indicating their belonging to a respected merchant class. Their means were sufficient to undertake a pilgrimage to sacred Delphi, yet not so great as to allow for excessive luxury on the journey. Penelope had outlived her husband 3 years prior. He had bequeathed to her a modest but profitable business, built on importing valuable fabrics from distant Egypt and subsequently selling them in the bustling markets of Corinth. Since then, she had managed not only to maintain but also to expand this enterprise, proving in practice to skeptical male competitors that a woman's mind was equally capable of shrewdly navigating complex trade routes, skillfully negotiating large contracts, and effectively managing a staff of workers, in no way inferior to men. However, at the moment her daughter reached marriageable age, Penelope found herself facing a momentous choice that could drastically alter their shared future. Many worthy men had already sought Melanippe's hand, and among them stood out one suitor whose offer promised exceptional benefits for the prosperity of the family business. This influential man possessed his own fleet of ships, which would allow Penelope to significantly expand her trading horizons, and his extensive contacts in Great Alexandria could open entirely new markets for her Egyptian goods. Yet Melanippe's heart did not lie with this shrewd and pragmatic suitor. Her soul was captivated by a young philosopher who possessed neither fortune nor the slightest interest in trade, but whose discussions on ethical principles, the nature of beauty and truth ignited genuine intellectual delight in her eyes. Penelope understood perfectly well how most mothers in her position would act. They would unequivocally arrange a profitable marriage, thereby guaranteeing their daughter's financial well-being, contributing to the expansion of the family enterprise, and sincerely believing that a tender affection would inevitably develop between spouses in a marriage of convenience. Such an approach was considered not merely logical, but absolutely correct by the overwhelming majority. However, Penelope still vividly remembered her own marriage. Her chosen husband had once been selected by her father, based solely on pragmatic considerations. And although a genuine, deep affection had developed between them over the years, she was always haunted by an unspoken question. What would it have been like to share her life with a man who could truly comprehend her innermost thoughts and cherished dreams? Therefore, her appeal to the Delphic oracle contained a complex intertwining of personal experiences and pragmatic calculations. She asked, "Should my daughter marry for love or for cold calculation? How is a mother to choose between her child's true happiness and her secure safety?" Apollo's answer, delivered through the Pythia's lips, came in words that seemed addressed to both women simultaneously. A foundation resting on sincere affection can bear a far heavier load than one resting solely on gold. However, affection devoid of practical wisdom builds only houses that inevitably crumble in the first storm. Seek a union that equally honors the call of the heart and the arguments of reason. Mother and daughter left sacred Delphi, carrying with them much to ponder and discuss at length. The oracle did not show them a direct path, did not provide a ready-made solution, but gave them a solid foundation to understand all available options much more clearly. Over the following months, they spent long evenings immersed in lively discussions about the kind of life Melanippe wished to build for herself. The young woman realized that, despite her deep affection for the philosopher's profound mind, she also highly valued the independence and sense of security that a successful business enterprise provided. She did not want to live her days in constant financial anxiety, even if that were compensated by the most elevated intellectual conversations. Meanwhile, Penelope came to understand that her daughter's true happiness was incomparably more valuable than any potential expansion of their trading business. She was perfectly capable of maintaining and even successfully developing her current commercial operations without the need for a particularly advantageous marriage alliance. However, what she could not replace was the chance for Melanippe to find a genuine partnership with a man who would appreciate not only her beauty, but also her keen intellect. Their final decision, reached after much deliberation, was quite unexpected to those around them. Melanippe married the philosopher, but at the same time actively engaged in her mother's business, becoming her full partner. Her husband, it turned out, possessed a remarkable talent for mathematical calculations, especially concerning currency exchange and commodity delivery schedules. Thus, this couple brought both refined intellectual sophistication and highly valuable practical skills to the family enterprise. Under their combined skillful leadership, the business began to rapidly prosper, exploring new markets and implementing innovative approaches in lending and banking, which brought them not only significant wealth, but also deep personal happiness. Their marriage became one of those rare examples of a partnership where fruitful practical cooperation did not supplant romantic love, but, on the contrary, only deepened and enriched it. These narratives of the farmer who found a middle ground, the warrior who became a mentor, the mother and daughter who rejected a false dilemma, are but a small fraction of the thousands of similar consultations that brought ordinary people to sacred Delphi for centuries. The vast majority of these everyday prophecies never made it into official temple annals. The oracle's guidance intended for kings and queens was carefully preserved, for it directly influenced the destinies of entire nations and states. However, the wise advice given to farmers, merchants, and young mothers was perceived as too private and specific to hold any significant historical value for posterity. Nevertheless, in many respects, it was precisely these simple, everyday appeals that constituted the very essence of what made Delphi a truly sacred place. They served as vivid proof that divine wisdom was accessible to everyone who approached it, with sincere need and heartfelt questions. These examples convincingly demonstrated that the gods cared not only about the grand rises and falls of empires, but also about the prosperity of each individual. The answers given by the oracle to ordinary mortals also revealed certain patterns, allowing us to more deeply understand how the ancient Greeks contemplated fundamental questions of existence. Apollo consistently urged people to seek creative, unconventional solutions, avoiding false either-or choices. He guided them towards solutions that harmoniously integrated a multitude of values, respect for tradition and a striving for innovation, reliable security and steady growth, personal aspirations and indispensable family obligations. In the wisdom of the deity, an emphasis on balance and foresightful planning was discernible. He instructed people not only to consider the immediate consequences of their actions, but also to deeply ponder how their decisions would affect the destinies of their children and the well-being of their communities in the long term. The deity encouraged them to develop such high virtues as courage, insight and justice, but always in such a way that these aspirations remained practically achievable and attainable in the conditions of their real lives. Perhaps the most important aspect of Apollo's guidance for ordinary people was that it clearly demonstrated that appealing to divine wisdom in no way meant evading personal responsibility for one's own decisions. The god never took on the burden of making decisions for mortals. On the contrary, he helped them to more clearly understand the available options, to view their circumstances from unfamiliar perspectives, and to develop the inner resources necessary for making wise decisions and subsequently living with their inevitable consequences. The farmer who gave his son the opportunity to explore Athens without severing family ties. The warrior who found a harmonious path of service to both strength and peace. The mother who supported her daughter in her quest for love, without sacrificing her security. All these people were compelled to delve into the practical nuances of implementing Apollo's instructions themselves. The deity granted wisdom and pointed to new perspectives, yet it was up to the people to demonstrate the necessary courage and creative ingenuity to build a better life. Such cooperation between divine guidance and human responsibility became one of the most distinctive features of Greek religion, manifesting in its most elevated forms. The gods appeared not as aloof rulers issuing peremptory decrees, but as wise mentors fostering mortals' own capacities for sound judgment and discernment. And this crucial capacity for sound judgment was tested not only in moments of life's greatest dramas, but also in countless seemingly insignificant decisions that actually determined whether one's existence would be fulfilling or, conversely, full of disappointments, whether their relationships would flourish or wither, whether their work would bring prosperity to their community or diminish it. The Delphic oracle understood perfectly well that the daily concerns of ordinary mortals held no less significance than the grandiose political crises that prompted kings and rulers to seek its counsel. A farmer's choice regarding his offspring's future might seem trivial compared to matters of war and peace, yet this decision inevitably impacted real human destinies, both immediately and in the long term. That is why Apollo addressed all who ascended the sacred mountain, carrying sincere questions and pure hearts. His wisdom was open to everyone who was willing to listen carefully and ponder deeply the words they heard. And for many centuries, this astonishing accessibility of divine guidance contributed to the formation of a culture that highly valued both pragmatic wisdom and deep spiritual reflection, both personal self-realization and civic responsibility. However, how exactly were these mysterious divinations of the Delphic oracle actually carried out? What happened in that moment when the Pythia plunged into a trance and began to utter words that seemed to come from beyond ordinary human perceptions and knowledge? The unravelling of these questions lies in some of the most extraordinary phenomena ever recorded at any cult site of the ancient world. Deep beneath Apollo's majestic temple, within the labyrinthine fissures and caves extending into the very heart of the sacred Mount Parnassus, truly peculiar things happened with the rock itself. There, water slowly seeps through layers of limestone, formed in those distant times when this land was still submerged beneath ancient seas. This same water, heated by the unceasing fire of slow geological processes, rises again to the surface, carrying with it dissolved minerals and mysterious gases from those profound depths that no living creature ever dared to penetrate. Most of these underground gas emissions are, in essence, harmless. They are ordinary vapours and carbon dioxide, a natural result of water interacting with rocks under high pressure and temperature. However, there are also more unusual gases, appearing as a result of chemical transformations that occur exclusively in very specific geological conditions. The oracle's chamber, it turns out, was located directly above one of the most active of these underground vents. For over a millennium, visitors to Delphi consistently reported extraordinary phenomena accompanying the Pythia's prophecies, sweet-smelling vapours rising from cracks in the temple floor, and an intoxicating aroma that seemed to plunge everyone who inhaled it deeply into altered states of consciousness. Particularly striking was how the prophetess herself would fall into a trance so profound that she seemed an entirely different being, uttering words in a voice that, witnesses swore, was utterly unlike her usual manner of speech. Ancient chroniclers meticulously recorded these phenomena. Plutarch, who served as a priest in Delphi in the 1st century AD, left records of a mysterious pneuma, a kind of breath or spirit, rising from the earth and filling the oracle chamber during prophetic sessions. He described these exhalations as having a distinctive pleasant odour, and inhaling them apparently induced a state of divine inspiration. Other classical authors in turn mentioned a sacred fissure in the temple floor, known as the Aditon, or Holy of Holies, where only the Pythia was permitted to enter. They recounted how she sat on her bronze tripod directly above this earthly crack, inhaling the vapours rising from the depths, awaiting the moment when Apollo's wisdom would fill her consciousness. For many centuries, scholars were inclined to assume that these ancient descriptions were purely mythological. The idea that geological processes could generate mind-altering gases seemed too convenient, too rationalistic an explanation for what was clearly perceived as a deeply spiritual phenomenon. When archaeologists began excavations at Delphi in the late 19th century, they found no evidence of cracks or gas emissions, which seemed to definitively confirm that the ancient narratives were no more than religious fantasies. However, in the 1990s, a group of scientists revisited the geology of Delphi, applying modern methodologies unavailable to previous generations of researchers. What they uncovered was truly astonishing. Apollo's temple was situated at the intersection of two major faults. These are cracks in the Earth's crust, where subterranean pressure creates precisely the conditions that can trigger unusual chemical reactions, These faults remain active to this day, periodically causing small earthquakes, which have always been a common occurrence in this region. More significantly, the specific type of limestone underlying Delphi contains bituminous deposits, organic material formed from ancient marine life which, when heated by geothermal processes, is capable of producing ethylene. Ethylene is a sweet-smelling chemical compound that in small concentrations induces a mild euphoric state. In higher concentrations, it can provoke hallucinations and profound altered states of consciousness. The scientific team was able to detect traces of ethylene in the spring water located near the temple, thereby confirming that this gas is still being generated by geological processes beneath Delphi. Researchers also found evidence that its concentrations would have been significantly higher in ancient times, when the faults were more active and the underground chambers were less disturbed by earthquakes and human excavations. This discovery in no way diminishes the spiritual significance of the oracle's prophecies, but it helps to explain how the Pythia could enter those deep trance states so vividly described by ancient witnesses. Imagine the prophetess seated on her bronze tripod in the inner chamber of Apollo's temple. The room is small and dimly lit, with only oil lamps casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Beneath her feet, a soft rumble of water moving through underground channels can be heard, a gentle sound that seems to echo her own breathing. She is prepared for this moment for many days, observing purification rituals. She has fasted until her body feels light and ethereal. She is bathed in sacred springs until her skin seems to glow with an inner light of its own. She has prayed and meditated until her mind is cleared of all personal thoughts and desires, completely open to whatever divine wisdom might fill it. Then she breathes deeply, filling her lungs with the temple's atmosphere. The air has a distinctive sweetness, almost like honey mixed with flowers, though this scent is unlike any she has ever encountered in the ordinary world. As she continues to breathe, this sweetness seems to spread throughout her body, creating a sensation of warmth and lightness that makes her feel as if she is floating above her physical form. Her consciousness begins to transform. The boundaries between herself and the surrounding world become less distinct. She feels the presence of the pilgrim waiting outside the chamber, whose anxiety and hope radiate like heat from a fire. She feels the collective attention of the priests and servants, their focused concentration adding to the spiritual intensity of the moment. And then, gradually, she becomes aware of something vast and luminous touching the edges of her mind. It is not Apollo himself. Gods do not simply appear to mortals in all their divine glory, but it is more like a shadow or reflection of divine consciousness, filtered through layers of mystery until it becomes something a human mind can encompass without being shattered. Knowledge begins to flow through her. It is not her own knowledge. She comprehends things about the pilgrim's life and situation that no one has told her. She sees connections and possibilities that her ordinary mind could never grasp. She realizes the complex web of cause and effect that will shape this person's future, depending on the choices they make in response to divine guidance. When she speaks the words, they surprise her as much as they do her listeners. It is her voice, but not her thoughts, her language, but not her knowledge. She hears herself utter prophecies that are at once profound and practical, enigmatic and clear, mysterious and perfectly suited to addressing the real questions underlying what the pilgrim believes they are asking. It was this combination of spiritual preparation and mild chemical alteration that made divination possible for the Oracle at Delphi. The ethylene vapours did not create the prophecy. They merely helped the Pythia achieve a state of consciousness in which divine inspiration could occur. It is important to realize that the ancient Greeks would have seen no contradiction between natural and supernatural explanations for the oracle's abilities. They believed that the gods acted through natural processes, not in defiance of them. The fact that Apollo chose to speak through a place where geological conditions created mind-altering vapours would have seemed like further confirmation of divine wisdom, not a debunking of divine presence. If one looks at it from their perspective, what is the probability that a sacred spring would coincidentally emerge precisely where underground gases create the ideal conditions for a mystical experience? What are the chances that the most spiritually potent place in the Greek world would also be the place where natural processes create the perfect environment for divine communication? From the Greek point of view, this was not a coincidence. It was providence. Apollo chose this specific location precisely because its natural properties made it suitable for his purposes. The god was acting through the very earth, using the planet's own geological processes to create a place where heaven and earth could meet. Modern scientific understanding of the oracle's trance states also helps explain some specific characteristics detailed by ancient witnesses. People under the influence of mild ethylene intoxication often experience heightened intuition and enhanced pattern recognition. They become more receptive to subtle social cues and emotional undertones that might otherwise be missed in an ordinary state. Their thinking becomes more associative and metaphorical, less constrained by the logical limitations that govern everyday consciousness. These effects would have made the Pythia extraordinarily sensitive to the non-verbal communication of the pilgrims who came for advice. Even without conscious awareness, she would have picked up on body language, tone of voice, subtle word choices, and other clues that revealed far more about people's situations than their explicit questions. Combined with her extensive training in psychology and counselling, for that is what the oracle's role essentially demanded, this heightened sensitivity would have given the Pythia an almost preternatural understanding of human nature and motivation. The trance state induced by ethylene would also have made the oracle's answers more creative and flexible. Instead of giving logical, linear advice based on conscious analysis, she would have drawn on deeper intuitive processes that could synthesize complex information in surprising and insightful ways. This explains why Apollo's prophecies were often enigmatic and metaphorical, rather than straightforward and literal. The oracle was not striving to be mysterious for mystery's sake. She was communicating from a state of consciousness where truth naturally expresses itself in symbols and patterns, rather than in direct statements. However, the vapours alone could not fully explain the extraordinary accuracy and profound wisdom of the guidance emanating from the Delphic oracle. Throughout history, countless individuals have experienced altered states of consciousness, yet few have become sources of such deep spiritual insight. What truly distinguished the Pythia was not only her unique ability to enter trance states, but also her meticulous training, her innate wisdom, her genuine spiritual development, and her profound understanding of human nature. The Delphic oracle represented an exceptional fusion of natural phenomena and cultural characteristics. Geological conditions provided the material basis for her mystical experiences, while rigorous spiritual training shaped the mental readiness for interpreting and conveying these revelations. The institutional support of the temple, in turn, created the necessary social context that allowed the oracle's wisdom to spread its influence throughout the Hellenic world. And, perhaps most importantly, the deeply ingrained cultural attitudes of ancient Greek society provided an interpretive framework that allowed people to recognize the voice of divine wisdom in the oracle's words, even when those words required deep contemplation and a creative approach for their practical implementation. The oracle functioned effectively because all its participants, the Pythia, the priests, the pilgrims, were convinced of its efficacy. They approached the experience with such an open and receptive attitude that true spiritual enlightenment became possible. They were willing to listen carefully, reflect deeply, and take responsibility for applying any guidance they received. The ethylene vapors were merely one element in a multifaceted and complex system that encompassed geology, psychology, spirituality, and culture. Remove any of these elements, and the oracle would never have achieved its outstanding fame for its insight and veracity. This scientific understanding of the oracle's methods in no way diminishes its grandeur. If anything, it only elevates Delphi's achievements, making them even more astonishing. The ancient Greeks built a unique institution where natural phenomena, spiritual practices, psychological insight, and social wisdom harmoniously merged to produce guidance that contributed to the rise of one of the most magnificent civilizations in human history. They understood, perhaps better than we do, that the sacred and the natural are not antagonistic categories at all. Divine will manifests through the natural order of the world, without violating its laws. Apollo spoke through the oracle not by suppressing the ordinary functioning of human consciousness, but, on the contrary, by creating optimal conditions under which consciousness could reach its highest and most insightful state. And late at night, when the pilgrims had left the sanctuary, and a deep silence reigned within the temple walls, when the oil lamps cast a flickering, subdued light, and the mountain was enveloped in serene night, these mysterious vapours invariably continued to rise from the depths of the earth. The sweet aroma emanating from the mountain's core continued to seep through the narrow fissures in the temple floor, carrying with it the enduring possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, any culture, any person who approaches the sacred with true reverence and a genuinely open soul. However, the oracle was only one part of Delphi's rich sacred life. Throughout the year, the mountain came alive with the sounds of music and jubilant festivities as people from all over the Greek world flocked to honor Apollo in grand festivals that harmoniously blended deep religious piety with elegant artistic competitions and impressive athletic achievements. This transformation began many months before the event itself. Skilled stonemasons arrived to repair any damage to the stadium and hippodrome. Merchants set up temporary stalls lining every available path. Their colourful awnings created a veritable labyrinth of commerce, spread across the mountainside like a multicoloured tapestry. The inns in the town below expanded their premises, adding rooms and courtyards to accommodate the thousands of pilgrims and guests who flocked to this sacred place. Every fourth summer, at the very peak of the season, when the mountain air shimmered with heat, making the marble temple seem to glow from within, Delphi transformed from a quiet place of pilgrimage into something both magnificent and bustling with chaos. It became the arena for the Pythian Games, a grand festival of Apollo, attracting the greatest athletes, most talented musicians, and inspired poets from all corners of the ancient world. However, the most significant preparations were purely spiritual. Apollo's priests spent weeks performing meticulous purification rituals that made the entire sacred precinct ready for the intense religious activity accompanying the festival. Every altar was ritually cleansed. Every statue was washed and anointed with sacred oils. Every structure was blessed with incense and prayers. A traveller arrives in Delphi 3 days before the official start of the festival. He is travelling with a group of musicians from Athens who hope to compete for victory in the musical contests, which are the very soul of the Pythian Games. Unlike the famous Olympic Games, which focus predominantly on athletic competitions, the Pythian Games give equal, if not greater, attention to artistic achievements. For this is a festival of Apollo, and Apollo is the patron of the lyre as much as he is the lord of prophecy. The scene before him was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. The usually silent mountain paths now teemed with people speaking dozens of different dialects, athletes from Sparta and Sicily, poets from the islands, musicians from Greek colonies in Asia Minor and southern Italy. The air literally vibrated with anticipation and nervous tension as participants prepared for events that would define their reputation and glory throughout the Hellenic world. These games themselves were established in honour of Apollo's victory over Pythia, commemorating that fateful moment when the young god proclaimed this mountain his sacred abode. But they are also a celebration of all that Apollo embodies: music and poetry, physical perfection, the harmonious unity between body and spirit that the Greeks considered an integral part of a full and worthy life. Yet this night, as he rehearses by the meagre light of oil lamps, while the mountain is enveloped in serene darkness around him, the music flows with such perfection that it fills him with deep confidence. The strings of his lyre seem to have found their own voices. The notes ring pure and flawless. The flutist's melody skillfully weaves into his harmonies, like a silver thread piercing a golden tapestry. The singer's voice soars above this sonic splendour, carrying ancient words with such poignant power that everyone within earshot involuntarily pauses their activities to listen. He and his fellow musicians find lodging in a temporary camp that has spontaneously sprung up in an olive grove located below the sacred precinct. Tents and simple wooden huts shelter hundreds of festival participants, forming a temporary city that exists only for the duration of the games. Campfires blaze everywhere, and the aroma of roasted meat intertwines with the sweet scent of pine resin and the pungent, dusty smell of the summer earth. Their group spends the evening before the opening ceremony meticulously rehearsing the hymn to Apollo that they will perform in the musical competition. This piece, which they have painstakingly worked on for months, is a complex composition recounting Apollo's birth on Delos and his subsequent journey to Delphi to claim the oracle. The melody is intricate, requiring flawless coordination between lyre, flute, and vocal. One false note, one moment of desynchronization, and months of painstaking preparation will prove futile. However, the first harbingers of impending misfortune appeared not in the form of marching armies or formidable siege engines, but in the guise of a mundane administrative dispute that, at first glance, seemed almost comically insignificant compared to the grandiose consequences it would ultimately provoke. In 595 BC, representatives of the city of Crisa arrived in Delphi with a proposal they considered entirely reasonable. Crisa, controlling the port where the vast majority of pilgrims arrived before beginning their journey up the sacred mountain, already levied fees for the use of its port facilities. Now, they sought to extend these charges to all offerings brought to Apollo's temple without exception. The Delphic priests were seized with deep horror. The oracle was traditionally funded solely by voluntary offerings from pilgrims and city-states, gifts freely brought in honor of the deity who granted divine guidance. The very thought of taxing these sacred donations seemed to them a fundamental violation of all the principles that Delphi embodied. However, Crisa's representatives remained indifferent to religious arguments. They pointed out that their city provided Apollo's pilgrims with vital services, port facilities, convenient storage, and lodging for travelers arriving too late to ascend the sacred mountain. Why, then, should they not receive fair compensation for these services? Why should Delphi reap all the economic benefits from the oracle, while Crisa bore all the costs of maintaining the infrastructure that made pilgrimage possible? This dispute could well have been resolved through reasonable negotiations and mutually beneficial compromises. Such commercial disagreements were ordinarily settled by Greek city-states through arbitration or diplomatic exchange. However, to the deep regret of all involved parties, the conflict, which began over port fees, became inextricably linked to far larger political tensions that were simmering throughout the Hellenic world. Several powerful city-states actively sought opportunities to enhance their dominance over Delphi and its renowned oracle. Athens aimed to ensure that Apollo's prophecies invariably served Athenian interests. Sparta, in turn, hoped to prevent its rivals from gaining excessive control over the most significant religious site in all of Greece. The rising power of Thessaly in northern Greece threatened to disrupt the traditional balance of power that had for centuries ensured Delphi's independence from singular political domination. When the Delphic priests rejected Chrysa's tax demands, more powerful political forces saw a favourable opportunity to intervene, seeking to advance their own strategic interests while appearing to defend religious freedom and sacred traditions. The Amphictyonic League, an association of Greek tribes and cities charged with safeguarding Delphi, declared Chrysa's actions a sacrilege against the god Apollo. The tax on offerings was deemed a blasphemous theft from the deity himself, a crime so grave that it demanded immediate military intervention to restore justice. However, the true underlying reason for these events lay not in upholding religious principles, but in a struggle for influence and control, in the desire to determine who would have the decisive voice in matters affecting all of Hellas. The ensuing sacred war would last a full 10 years, drawing all the major powers of the ancient world into its vortex. A young warrior from Athens, part of the expeditionary force sent by his city to support the League's actions against Chrysa, like most of his comrades, sincerely believed he was fighting to defend the oracle from an impious attempt at taxation. He had been raised from childhood on tales of Apollo's boundless wisdom and Delphi's sacred significance, and the very thought that someone would dare to profit from the pious devotion of pilgrims deeply offended his sense of religious propriety. However, the harsh reality of war, when it finally presented itself in all its ugliness, proved far more complex and morally ambiguous than the simple tale of defending sacred traditions that had inspired his military service. The siege of Chrysa began as a typical military operation. The city was surrounded, supply lines were cut, and siege engines were erected to breach its walls. But Chrysa proved well fortified and adequately provisioned, and its defenders fought not merely to preserve a tax policy, but for their homes and families. Months passed without any decisive progress. The siege gradually evolved into a grueling war of attrition, consuming colossal resources and yielding very little military success. Soldiers on both sides began to question whether the initial dispute was worth such levels of destruction and suffering. But the political leaders who initiated this conflict had invested too much of their prestige in its outcome to agree to a peaceful negotiated settlement. Each side only escalated its tactics, hoping to achieve a breakthrough that would justify the costs already incurred. The Amphictyonic forces began intercepting ships that might deliver supplies to Chrysa, effectively establishing a blockade of the entire region and creating significant economic hardship for neutral cities whose prosperity depended on maritime trade. Chrysa, in response, launched raids into League territory, attacking farms and villages not directly involved in the main military campaign. What began as a conflict over taxation transformed into an all-out war that engulfed the entire eastern Mediterranean. Trade routes were disrupted. Agricultural production plummeted. Resources that could have been directed towards constructive purposes were irrevocably consumed by military operations that benefited no one. The young warrior participated in the fighting because he was a soldier and obeyed orders, but he increasingly questioned whether this war brought anything positive to anyone involved. The religious righteousness that initially motivated the conflict was displaced by a simple impulse for violence. Each side continued to fight primarily because they had been at war for so long that ceasing hostilities would seem tantamount to admitting defeat. The turning point came when Solon of Athens, one of the most respected legal and ethical thinkers in the Greek world, proposed a solution that was both militarily effective and symbolically appropriate. Instead of continuing the endless siege, the League forces should divert the course of the Pleistos River so that it flowed through Chrysa's water supply system, poisoning the city's wells with hellebore, a poisonous plant sacred to Apollo. The plan worked with devastating efficiency. Within weeks, Chrysa's population was weakened by disease and unable to continue effective resistance. The city surrendered, its walls were demolished, and its territory was declared sacred to Apollo, never again to be cultivated or settled. The victory was solemnly celebrated as an act of divine justice, a punishment sent by Apollo himself through the hands of his devotees. However, the warrior from Athens, having seen enough of war, already understood that divine justice bore a striking resemblance to human cruelty when enacted through military force. The sacred war concluded with the preservation of Delphi's independence and the elimination of Chrysa's threat to the Oracle. But it also established a precedent that would haunt the Greek world for centuries. The idea that religious considerations could justify destructive military interventions, that the defense of sacred traditions demanded the complete annihilation of those who threatened them. In a more immediate sense, the war altered the balance of power around Delphi itself. The Amphictyonic League emerged from the conflict with noticeably strengthened authority over the oracle's activities. Member cities gained significant influence over the process of selecting priests and interpreting prophecies. What was once a relatively independent religious institution now found itself more closely integrated with the political structures of the Greek world. This integration brought both advantages and dangers. The Oracle's council became more politically astute, better adapted to the complex diplomatic realities that shaped relations between cities and kingdoms. However, it also became more biased, more inclined to reflect the interests of powerful league members rather than purely divine wisdom. The First Sacred War, as historians would later call it, established patterns that would recur throughout Delphi's subsequent history. Whenever the Oracle's independence seemed threatened, whenever political forces attempted to control divine guidance for their own ends, military conflict inevitably followed. But these wars also demonstrated something important about the Oracle's role in ancient Greek civilization. People were willing to fight and die to protect access to divine wisdom, to preserve institutions that linked human communities to transcendent sources of guidance and meaning. 50 years after the destruction of Crisa, the Second Sacred War erupted when Phocis forcibly attempted to establish control over Delphi. This conflict proved shorter, but no less brutal, ending with the defeat of the Phocians and the execution of their leaders as sacrilegious criminals. A century later, the Third Sacred War became one of the most destructive conflicts in ancient Greek history. Philip II of Macedon used the dispute over Delphi as a pretext for military interventions that would ultimately lead to Macedonian dominance over the entire Greek world. Each war followed a similar pattern. Political tensions led to conflicts over the administration of Delphi or the independence of the Oracle. Religious arguments were used to justify military intervention. The resulting war caused far more damage than the original disagreements warranted, and when the fighting ended, the political balance shifted in a way that made future conflicts more likely, rather than less. The Athenian warrior survives the First Sacred War and returns to his home city with an experience that shapes his understanding of both politics and religion for the rest of his life. He has seen how easily sacred matters can be manipulated to serve worldly ambitions. He has witnessed the deep disconnect between the noble ideals that motivate soldiers and the brutal realities that actually produce wars. But he has also seen something else, the genuine reverence that ordinary people hold for Delphi and the Oracle. He has realized how shared religious traditions can unite communities with little else in common. He has understood the importance of preserving institutions that remind humanity of its connections to sources of wisdom, transcending individual desires or even collective interests. The Sacred Wars reveal both the best and worst aspects of ancient Greek civilization. The willingness to fight for transcendent principles demonstrates the deep spiritual commitments of the culture. However, the way these battles are waged reveals the limitations of human nature, the tendency for even religious motives to be distorted by pride and ambition, and the simple, brutal impulse for violence. Apollo, speaking through his oracle, continues to give guidance throughout these conflicts. His prophecies help both to end wars and to prevent them, offering wisdom that transcends the partisan perspectives of the various combatants. But the voice of the god becomes harder to hear clearly when political noise drowns out spiritual silence, when the sacred mountain echoes with the clang of weapons rather than the peaceful murmur of pilgrims seeking divine guidance. The wars also altered the experience of visiting Delphi for ordinary pilgrims. What was once a purely religious journey became a more complex undertaking, requiring attention to political events and military risks. Travellers had to consider not only their spiritual questions, but also the current state of relations between their home cities and the forces controlling access to the oracle. Some pilgrims were deterred by these complexities, preferring to seek divine guidance from local oracles rather than undertaking a potentially dangerous journey to Delphi. However, many others continued to make the pilgrimage despite the risks, motivated by a deep understanding that Apollo's wisdom at its source was worth any dangers the journey might entail. These devoted pilgrims often found that their time in Delphi did not lose, but on the contrary deepened its significance due to the trials they had to overcome on their way to the sacred mountain. The effort invested in maintaining access to divine wisdom multiplied its value many times over when it was finally attained. The sacred wars also served as a vivid testament to the astonishing resilience of the oracle. Despite decades of military confrontations, despite attempts by various powers to subjugate or manipulate this institution, Apollo invariably continued to speak through his priestess. The fundamental functions of the oracle survived political upheavals capable of destroying kingdoms and redrawing the borders of the ancient world. This survival is not accidental. The oracle continues to exist because it fulfills needs that transcend political boundaries and military clashes. Humanity will always require support for making complex decisions, comfort in moments of uncertainty, and a connection to sources of meaning that are significantly broader than their immediate life circumstances. As long as these needs persist, institutions like Delphi will find ways to continue their vital work, regardless of external pressures. However, wars leave their indelible mark on the oracle's reputation and influence. What was once perceived as a purely divine institution gradually begins to be seen as a more human organization, subject to the same political pressures and moral compromises that affect all powerful institutions. Prophecies lose some of their mysterious power when people begin to perceive the political calculations that sometimes influence their interpretation. The sacred wars represent a turning point in Delphi's history, a moment when the oracle's role in ancient civilization became more complex and ambiguous. The institution retained its significance and influence, but it could no longer claim the pure spiritual authority that characterized it in earlier centuries. And as the Greek world faced new challenges, the rise of Macedonian power, the expansion of Rome, the cultural changes that would ultimately transform ancient civilization, the oracle would have to adapt again, finding new ways to provide divine guidance in an increasingly complicated world. But first, it would have to face perhaps its greatest test, the invasion of the most powerful empire the ancient world had ever seen. A threat so overwhelming that only divine intervention seemed capable of preserving Greek independence. The messenger arrived in Delphi in the pre-dawn darkness of a summer morning in 480 BC. His horse, covered in foam and exhausted from the desperate gallop along the mountain trails. He brought news that struck cold fear into every person in the sacred precinct. Xerxes and his enormous Persian army had crossed the Hellespont and were moving towards Greece with such force that it darkened the land like a locust plague. The numbers were almost unbelievable. Persian heralds claimed Xerxes commanded more than 1 million soldiers, gathered from all corners of the vast empire stretching from India to Egypt. His fleet included ships from Phoenicia and Cyprus, Egypt and Ionia, manned by the most experienced sailors of the ancient world. This was not just another border war or political dispute. This was an invasion aimed at conquering and absorbing the entire Greek world into the Persian Empire. Every major Greek city mobilized for what might be the final battle for Hellenic independence. Athens recalled its citizens from across the Mediterranean. Sparta prepared to lead a coalition of city-states in a desperate defense of Greek freedom. But even the most optimistic military strategists understood that the odds were overwhelmingly against them, which raised a terrifying question for the priests and pilgrims in Delphi. What would happen to Apollo's sacred mountain when the Persians arrived? Xerxes had shown little respect for Greek religious traditions during his march through northern Greece. Persian soldiers looted temples, melted down sacred statues for gold, and used sanctuaries as military camps. There was no reason to expect them to treat Delphi any differently, despite its reputation as the most sacred place in the Greek world. The temple treasuries contained riches that had accumulated for centuries. Golden statues and silver vessels, bronze tripods and ivory sculptures, precious stones and rare metals from all corners of the Mediterranean. The value of these offerings could finance military campaigns for years. No Persian commander was likely to leave such prizes untouched out of respect for a Greek god. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, control of Delphi would give Xerxes an enormous psychological advantage over any Greek cities that continued to resist Persian rule. If the oracle predicted a Persian victory, if Apollo himself seemed to support Xerxes' claims to dominion over Greece, the morale impact on Greek resistance would be devastating. So Apollo's priests faced an agonizing decision. Should they try to evacuate the most valuable treasures, hiding them in caves or sending them to distant colonies where Persian armies might never reach? Should they try to negotiate with Xerxes, offering cooperation in exchange for the protection of the sacred site? Or should they trust in the power of their god to protect his own sanctuary, no matter how overwhelming the human threat might seem? The debates continued for several days among the temple's senior priests. Some argued for practical measures, dispersing treasures, preparing hiding places in the mountains, developing contingency plans for the oracle's functions to continue from other locations. Others insisted that such preparations would demonstrate a lack of faith in Apollo's ability to protect his own sacred land. The discussion grew more urgent when scouts reported that a Persian advance detachment had been separated from the main army, with orders to proceed directly to Delphi. These were not mere reconnaissance troops or foragers. This was a significant military formation, equipped for siege warfare, clearly intended to seize the oracle and its treasures before any Greek relief forces could intervene. The inhabitants of Delphi, priests and pilgrims, merchants and artisans, everyone whose life was connected to the sacred mountain, faced the prospect of becoming refugees within a few days. Some families had already begun packing their most essential belongings, preparing to flee into the mountains before the Persians could encircle the sacred precinct. But then something extraordinary happened. A delegation of Delphians approached the oracle with a question they had never before had to ask. Should we abandon the sacred precinct to save our lives, or should we remain and defend Apollo's sanctuary, even if it means our death? The Pythia's answer was immediate and unequivocal. delivered with a certainty that astonished all who heard it. The god will protect his own. Those who trust Apollo should not fear mortal armies, however numerous or powerful they may seem. Stay at your posts and prepare to witness divine protection rarely seen by mortals. The prophecy quickly spread throughout the sacred precinct, bringing both comfort and apprehension to the people who had to decide whether to believe it. Was this genuine divine guidance, or was the oracle merely telling people what they wanted to hear during a desperate crisis? Some families chose to leave despite the prophecy, unwilling to risk their children's lives on what might be wishful thinking disguised as divine revelation. But most of the temple staff decided to stay, trusting in Apollo's protection and their own understanding of the god's power. The Persian advance guard arrived 3 days later, a column of professional soldiers stretching for miles along the mountain trails. Their bronze armor gleamed in the summer sun. Their weapons were well maintained and clearly effective. Their discipline was evident in the precision of their movements and the efficiency of their camp procedures. From the temple steps, watching this military machine organize itself to assault the sacred precinct, even the most loyal adherents of Apollo's defense began to wonder if they had made a fatal mistake. The Persians clearly had the numbers and equipment needed to overwhelm any resistance the small temple garrison could offer. But as the Persian commander began his preparations to attack the sacred precinct, strange things began to happen. The first sign was the weather, which seemed to appear out of nowhere. The summer sky, a moment ago clear and blue, suddenly filled with dark clouds that rolled over the mountain peaks like smoke from a vast fire. In the distance, thunder began to rumble, though there was no visible lightning to explain the sound. The Persian soldiers, seasoned veterans of campaigns in every climate, began to grow nervous. This was not ordinary weather. The clouds were too dark, the thunder was too constant. The sudden change in atmospheric pressure was too dramatic to be a natural phenomenon. Then came the moment when the ground beneath their feet began to reveal its unpredictable power. At first it was just a subtle tremor, a slight seismic oscillation common in this geologically active region. However, this movement steadily increased, turning into a palpable shaking that made the Persian warriors struggle to maintain their balance, and their war horses rear in panic. The earthquake reached its climax at the very moment the Persian commander gave the order to advance on the sacred temple. From the sheer cliffs rising above the sanctuary, giant boulders began to tumble, falling directly onto the assaulting detachments. Entire sections of the mountain range seemed to shift and slide, generating powerful avalanches that blocked vital paths necessary for the Persians' successful assault. But the most astonishing and terrifying sight was the light. Later, eyewitnesses would describe a dazzling radiance that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the temple, a golden glow that transformed the marble columns into something resembling solidified sunlight. This glow grew brighter and brighter, until it became almost impossible to look directly at Apollo's sanctuary, creating the impression that the god himself had descended from the heavens to protect his sacred abode. In this dazzling light, some Persian warriors claimed to see tall, glowing figures, wielding weapons of pure light, standing guard around the temple like divine sentinels. Regardless of whether these phenomena were genuine supernatural manifestations or hallucinations caused by a combination of fear, earthquake, and unusual atmospheric conditions, their impact on the Persian army's morale proved decisive. The attack collapses before it can truly begin. Persian soldiers, men who had shown bravery and fought successfully in dozens of campaigns, flee in panic from what they perceive as undeniable divine intervention. Their commander, realizing the complete demoralization of his troops, unable to continue the assault, orders a retreat to a safe distance to consider further action. However, Apollo has not yet finished his actions against the Persian forces. That same night, as the Persians camped a few miles from the sacred precinct, the attacks continue. Wolves descend from the mountains in unprecedented numbers, infiltrating the Persian camp and attacking sentries and sleeping soldiers. The animals show no fear of human weapons or fire, continuing their assaults with a ferocity that seems almost supernatural. Simultaneously, a mysterious illness begins to spread among the Persian ranks. A fever that first affects a few warriors quickly infects hundreds, leaving them too weak to fight and too sick to move. Persian physicians are bewildered, encountering symptoms they have never seen before, and their usual remedies prove utterly ineffective. By the third day, the Persian commander admits defeat. He orders his surviving troops to cease their attack on Delphi and rejoin the main army, reporting to Xerxes that the oracle is protected by divine forces too powerful for mortal soldiers. News of the Persian retreat spread throughout Greece with incredible speed, like a wildfire, providing a desperately needed morale boost to the Greek resistance. If Apollo could protect his own sanctuary from the most powerful army in the world, perhaps the gods had not abandoned Greece to Persian conquest. Perhaps there was still hope for preserving Hellenic independence. The oracle's survival also had practical military consequences. With Delphi still in Greek hands, the resistance continued to have access to divine guidance for strategic decisions. Apollo's prophecies helped coordinate the defensive efforts of the various city-states, providing a unity of purpose that would be crucial for any successful resistance to the Persian invasion. Most famously, the oracle gave guidance that helped the Athenians interpret another enigmatic prophecy about wooden walls meant to protect their city. Apollo's advice led them to understand that their ships, rather than their land fortifications, represented their best hope for survival, guidance that would prove crucial in the naval battle of Salamis. But what actually happened at Delphi during those 3 days when the Persian attack was repelled? Was it genuine divine intervention, natural phenomena occurring at a psychologically crucial moment, or some combination of supernatural and natural factors? Ancient sources differ in details, but they are unanimous about the outcome. The Persians retreated. Delphi remained in Greek hands, and the oracle continued to function throughout the invasion crisis. Whether you attribute it to Apollo's direct intervention or to an extraordinary coincidence of geological and meteorological events, the result was the same. Greece's most important religious institution survived the greatest existential threat it had ever faced. Modern geological research of the Delphi region confirms that the area is seismically active and that earthquakes frequently trigger rockfalls and avalanches of the type described in ancient chronicles. Weather patterns in the region can also change with dramatic suddenness, especially in the summer months when thermal conditions create rapid atmospheric instability. It is entirely possible that the Persian attack occurred precisely when natural forces were creating conditions that seemed supernatural to people who interpreted them as manifestations of divine will. From this perspective, Apollo's protection of his sanctuary operated through natural processes rather than in violation of them. The god protected his sacred land by utilizing the mountain's own geological and meteorological features. But even this naturalistic explanation does not diminish the significance of what transpired. The timing was so perfect, the coincidence so dramatically appropriate, that even skeptical observers would have had to concede that something extraordinary had occurred. Whether it was called divine intervention or miraculous good fortune, the result was that Greek morale was bolstered at a moment when it was most desperately needed. The Persian retreat from Delphi became one of the most famous examples of divine protection in ancient literature. It was told and retold as proof that the gods actively supported those who defended sacred traditions and cultural independence. The story inspired resistance movements throughout the Persian Empire, encouraging other peoples to believe that their local gods could also protect them from foreign domination. For the oracle itself, surviving the Persian threat established a new level of prestige and influence. Apollo's prophecies gained additional authority through the demonstration that the god could protect his own sanctuary even against overwhelming military force. Pilgrims journeyed to Delphi not only seeking guidance but also hoping to witness the place where divine intervention had saved Greek civilization. The Persian invasion also marked a turning point in how the oracle related to political events. Before the crisis, Apollo's prophecies typically focused on individual guidance and local disputes. After the demonstration of divine power in international affairs, the oracle became more involved in the great political and military questions that shaped the ancient world. This increased political involvement brought both opportunities and dangers. The oracle's counsel became more influential in shaping historical events, but it also became more controversial. People began to scrutinize the oracle's prophecies more carefully, looking for evidence of political bias or manipulation. But in 480 BC, as news of the Persian retreat spread throughout the Greek world, such concerns seemed far less important than the simple fact that Apollo's sacred mountain had been preserved. The god who speaks of the future had demonstrated that he could also shape the present when circumstances demanded divine intervention. And in the years that followed, as Greece recovered from the devastation of the Persian wars, pilgrims would continue to ascend the sacred mountain, seeking guidance from the god who had proven that no mortal force, however mighty, could overcome the divine protection of what is truly sacred. The oracle endured, and with it, the ancient world's vital link between human wisdom and divine knowledge was preserved. But the Persian crisis also showed how much the Greek world had changed, how complex the political landscape had become, and how the oracle had to adapt to serve communities that were increasingly connected by international rather than purely local concerns. The sacred mountain, which once seemed isolated from worldly affairs, had become a center of political as well as religious influence. And the treasures that pilgrims had brought to honor Apollo for centuries had become symbols not only of devotion, but also of the wealth and power that made Greek independence worth defending. The path leading to the majestic temple of Apollo along the sacred way gracefully curves past a series of marble structures. These buildings, striking in their exquisite beauty and luxurious adornment, seem designed to make every traveller pause in deep admiration. They are known as treasuries, relatively small but monumental temple-like structures. They were erected by numerous Greek city-states to carefully house their gifts intended for Apollo, and simultaneously to display their own abundance, outstanding artistic achievements, and unwavering devotion to the deity who spoke through his oracle. Each of these treasuries is a silent storyteller, recounting not only the events etched on its marble friezes or the inscriptions carved on its walls. It reveals a much deeper narrative about a specific community's relationship with the divine, about their understanding of how human accomplishments should be dedicated to serving higher, transcendent ideals. The Athenian treasury, restored after the destructive Persian wars, gleams dazzling white in the morning sun like freshly fallen snow. Noble marble quarried from Mount Pentelicon was used for its construction. The walls of this structure are adorned with metopes, skillfully crafted square marble panels on which are immortalized the heroic adventures of Theseus and Heracles. These masterpieces were created by artisans whose names have remained in the memory of posterity many centuries after their passing. However, the true value housed deep within this building does not consist of precious metals such as gold or silver. It is a collection of ordinary ceramic shards, humble fragments of pottery, that served as ballots in the unique system of Athenian democracy. In moments when fateful political decisions needed to be made, free citizens wrote names on these so-called ostraca and dropped them into special urns, thereby determining which leaders would steer their great city. A natural question arises: why did Athens decide to dedicate such unpretentious objects in a treasury usually filled to the brim with golden cups and silver tripods? The answer lies in the fact that these humble ceramic shards symbolize something incomparably more valuable than any precious metal. They represent the fundamental principle that every ordinary citizen possesses an inalienable right to a voice in making decisions that determine the future of their community. By offering these democratic ballots as gifts to Apollo, the Athenians unequivocally acknowledged that their political system was founded on both divine wisdom and sound human judgment. An inscription above the treasury entrance reads, "The Athenians dedicated this treasury to Apollo from the spoils of Marathon as a sign of their gratitude for the victory over the Persians. However, the building itself represents something far greater than merely commemorating a military triumph. It embodies Athens' profound understanding that their democracy and their freedom are gifts from the gods, blessings that require constant appreciation and careful, responsible stewardship." Adjacent to the Athenian treasury stands a smaller, yet no less impressive building, dedicated by the island of Sipnos. This structure gained renown throughout the ancient world for its caryatids, columns artfully carved in the form of graceful female figures who seem to effortlessly support the roof on their heads. The sculptural mastery achieved such perfection that the hard marble seemed to transform into living, breathing flesh. Each of these figures embodies a particular aspect of feminine strength and beauty. The Sipnian treasury contains gifts that eloquently attest to the island's unique relationship with Apollo. Sipnos was generously endowed by nature with rich silver mines, providing the abundance that allowed for such lavish dedications. However, the islanders were well aware of the temporary nature of their prosperity. Mineral wealth could be depleted, mines could collapse, and economic conditions could change so rapidly that yesterday's abundance could overnight turn into acute scarcity. That is why the Sipnians made the wise decision to use their fleeting wealth to create something eternal, a tribute to Apollo that would continue to honor the deity long after their silver mines were completely exhausted. Their treasury became a kind of spiritual investment, where material prosperity was exchanged for unfading divine favor. The most valuable exhibits housed in this building, contrary to expectations, were not made of silver, despite the island's colossal wealth derived from mining. Instead, the treasury carefully preserved a collection of songs, hymns dedicated to Apollo, written by talented Siphnian poets and meticulously engraved on durable bronze tablets, destined to outlast even human voices. These musical offerings represent the islanders' profound understanding. Artistic beauty possesses far greater value than transient material luxury. The creation of something truly beautiful, in their conviction, represented the highest form of service to the god of harmony and proportion. The treasury of the Sicyonians, in turn, tells an entirely different story. Erected to commemorate their victory at the first Pythian Games, this circular building represents a bold departure from traditional rectangular temple design, creating something utterly innovative and visually stunning. Its innovative architecture serves as a vivid reflection of Sicyon's long-standing reputation as a distinguished centre of artistic experimentation. This was a city where sculptors and artists tirelessly developed new techniques that profoundly influenced the development of all Greek art for many centuries. Inside this treasury, alongside the expected offerings of precious metals and exquisite crafts, is an unusual collection of wooden models, miniature versions of theatrical sets that were used in Sicyonian dramatic festivals. These modest items, skillfully carved from olive wood and painted with vibrant mineral pigments, symbolize one of humanity's greatest achievements: the development of theatre as a powerful means to explore profound moral and philosophical questions through stories capable of touching both the intellect and the subtlest human emotions. While these wooden models lack significant material value, their cultural significance is truly priceless. They mark a turning point when mere entertainment was elevated to the level of education, when storytelling was transformed into an indispensable tool for comprehending the deepest mysteries of human existence. By dedicating these theatrical artifacts to Apollo, Sicyon expresses its recognition of the god's role as patron of all artistic endeavours that foster a clearer understanding of people themselves and the world around them. However, not all treasuries serve as symbols of flourishing communities celebrating their achievements. The Cnidian treasury houses one of the most poignant collections of offerings ever dedicated in Delphi. It is a series of marble sculptures depicting refugees forced to flee their homeland, carrying their most precious belongings in search of new lands where they could rebuild their lives. The city of Cnidus was destroyed by a devastating earthquake, rendering it uninhabitable. Its population dispersed to numerous colonies and foreign cities throughout the Mediterranean. The survivors, gathering their meagre remaining resources, decided to erect this treasury as a sorrowful memorial to their lost homeland, and as a fervent prayer for Apollo's protection during their arduous exile. The sculptures commissioned by the Cnidians are striking in their heartbreaking realism. In the carved features of the faces, one can read deep weariness in the slumped shoulders, unbending resolve, and in the overall appearance, the terrifying sorrow of people who have lost everything familiar and are forced to start life anew in completely unfamiliar places. However, in these images, glimpses of hope can also be discerned: the persistent human unwillingness to succumb to despair, the unwavering faith that even the most terrible catastrophes can be overcome with divine help and through community support. The Nidian treasury serves as a powerful reminder to every visitor to Delphi that prosperity and security are fragile gifts. It teaches that disaster can strike even the most successful communities, and that true wealth lies not in accumulated material possessions, but in the connections and values that help people rebuild after everything else has been irrevocably lost. Perhaps the most enigmatic of all the treasuries is the one erected by the Massaliotes, Greeks from the colony of Massalia, now known as Marseille, located in southern modern-day France. This building houses offerings that eloquently reflect the unique challenges of preserving Greek culture in a foreign land, surrounded by Celtic tribes whose traditions and languages differed radically from Hellenic customs. The Massalian treasury contains artifacts that might seem quite unusual to visitors from the Greek heartland. Among them are bronze torques worn by Celtic chieftains who became allies of the Greek colonists, silver coins with images skillfully blending Greek and Celtic artistic motifs, and weapons combining Greek metalworking techniques with distinctive Celtic decorative styles. However, the most significant of all offerings is a collection of scrolls containing the constitution of Massalia, a body of laws meticulously crafted to regulate how Greeks could preserve their cultural identity while adapting to life in an entirely foreign environment. These legal documents represent one of the first systematic attempts in human history to address the complex problem of multiculturalism, creating institutions that carefully preserved core traditions while allowing for necessary practical adaptations to new circumstances. The offerings of the Massaliotes vividly demonstrate Apollo's universal significance. The god's wisdom is not limited to the Greek-speaking world, but can guide any community that seeks divine assistance in building just and harmonious societies. The influence of the Delphic oracle extended far beyond the Mediterranean, impacting the development of Greek colonies in Spain and France, Egypt and southern Italy. Everywhere, Hellenic communities took root in foreign lands. Continuing a leisurely stroll among these majestic treasuries, one begins to realize that these structures embody something far deeper than mere civic pride or traditional religious piety. They stand before the gaze as a kind of spiritual museum, a grand collection of humanity's greatest achievements, brought as a token of sincere gratitude to the divine forces that made such accomplishments possible. Thus, in the Corinthian treasury, delicate models of ships are carefully preserved, ships that opened new, vital trade routes between Greece and the Western Mediterranean. In the Aetolian treasury, one can see examples of standardized silver coins, which by creating a reliable medium of exchange, made international trade possible, fostering prosperity. And in the Theban treasury, weapons and armor are displayed, trophies from battles that preserved Greek independence from foreign invasion, symbolizing the resilience and courage of the Hellenes. Each architectural structure here exalts a particular facet of human creativity and courage. Together they create a multifaceted dedication to everything that lays the foundations of human society, art and science, law and religion, trade and martial valor, individual excellence and communal cooperation. However, these treasuries also represent a kind of unspoken spiritual rivalry. Each city strives for its offering to Apollo to be grander than its rivals. its building more elegant, and its dedication more magnificent. It is this spirit of competition that transforms deep religious reverence into a powerful catalyst for unprecedented artistic and architectural breakthroughs. The result of this interaction is a sacred space that serves as a brilliant demonstration of the pinnacles of Greek civilization's mastery. Visitors to Delphi not only come to consult the oracle, they comprehend the concentrated embodiment of all that makes their culture worthy of careful preservation and relentless defense. The artistic competition between the treasuries encourages a continuous pursuit of perfection in sculpture and architecture. Masters from various city-states exchange innovative techniques and original concepts, creating a fertile cross-pollination of creative impulses that enriches the cultural heritage of the Hellenic world as a whole. Thus, the Athenian treasury influences the architectural decisions of the Theban treasury, which in turn inspires bold innovations in the Argive treasury. This creative exchange makes Delphi a focal point not only of deep religiosity, but also of vibrant artistic activity. The sacred precinct transforms into a hub where the most outstanding masters of their time arrive to showcase their skill and learn from colleagues. The echoes of these fruitful contacts reverberate far beyond Delphi as artists return to their home cities bringing fresh concepts and refined techniques. The treasuries also play a significant role in diplomatic relations. They provide an impartial arena where representatives from different cities can meet and confer, free from the political bias that might hinder discussions in their own cities. Many fateful alliances and significant agreements are conceived and first considered under the shadow of Apollo's majestic temple, with the sacred presence of the gods believed to guarantee the sincerity of intentions and impeccable good faith in interstate negotiations. The offerings carefully preserved in the treasuries create an indelible testament to the dynamics of interpolis relations. When Athens and Sparta join forces to defend Hellas against the Persian invasion, their shared offering in the Pan-Hellenic treasury forever records this cooperation for future ages. When Corinth and Corcyra resolve a commercial conflict by seeking the oracle's wisdom, their thank offerings serve as documentary evidence of the peaceful resolution of the dispute for those who come after them. Over time, the treasuries become not only repositories of deep religious veneration, but also invaluable historical memory. Future generations can wander among these majestic structures and comprehend the chronicle of their civilization, etched in marble and bronze, understanding how their ancestors overcame adversity and achieved triumphs that paved the way to the present. But the treasuries also expose the flip side of Hellas's great achievements. Many of the most magnificent offerings were created using material wealth obtained through conquest or ruthless exploitation. The precious gold shining on Apollo's altars was often extracted by the hands of slaves, toiling in inhumanely dangerous conditions. The silver, which financed magnificent works of art, sometimes came as tribute, collected from less powerful city-states. This ethical dilemma adds further depth to the spiritual meaning of the treasuries. They serve as a reminder to visitors that human achievements are always a dual blessing, that even the most sublime creations can be tarnished by the circumstances of their origin. Apollo's divine wisdom helped people find their bearings in these complex ethical labyrinths, opening paths to the creation of just and harmonious societies, but without turning a blind eye to the price such societies sometimes exacted from others. The Delian treasury perhaps holds the most deeply considered solution to this moral dilemma. The island of Delos, revered as Apollo's birthplace, was also one of the most significant centres of the slave trade in the ancient world. The islanders used profits from human trafficking to create grandiose dedications to the deity, but they also introduced legislation to protect slaves and established special institutions that facilitated the integration of freed slaves into full citizenship. Among the exhibits in their treasuries are documents enshrining these innovative legal provisions, vividly illustrating the capacity of communities to recognize the moral cost of their prosperity, actively striving to minimize the harm inflicted by their economic structures. The example of the Delians eloquently demonstrates how divine guidance can inspire people to fundamentally transform unjust social institutions, rather than passively accepting them as immutable realities. As evening descends and the setting sun paints the marble facades of the treasuries with shifting hues of gold, soft pink, and deep purple, it becomes evident that these buildings represent an unending dialogue between the human spirit and the divine. Each offering is both a sincere gratitude for mercies previously bestowed and a humble plea for guidance in the future. Each treasury is both a triumphant celebration of human achievements and an acknowledgement of deep dependence on sources of wisdom far exceeding limited human understanding. The treasuries are destined to stand for many centuries, enduring the onslaught of earthquakes and enemy invasions, surviving political cataclysms and profound cultural transformations. Some will suffer destruction and be rebuilt. Others will be plundered by conquerors, stripped of their priceless treasures. Still others will simply fall into ruin as the communities that erected them fade into the annals of history. Nevertheless, their profound purpose will invariably persist as long as people strive to relate their transient achievements to enduring, eternal values. As long as communities wish to dedicate their greatest accomplishments to serving transcendent ideals. The Oracle at Delphi tirelessly continues to proclaim divine wisdom in response to the pressing questions of mortals. However, the treasuries forming a picturesque ring around Apollo's temple hold another truth, the truth that human genius and divine inspiration can merge, giving birth to beauty that outlives not only its creators, but entire civilizations. Within these majestic marble structures filled to the brim with gifts of gold and silver, bronze and ivory, one can behold both the dazzling glory and the delicate fragility of human achievements. It becomes clear why people from age to age continue to ascend this sacred mountain, seeking guidance from the all-seeing deity who encompasses all possibilities, all consequences, all the diverse ways in which mortal decisions can serve immortal purposes. The treasuries of Delphi stand as an enduring testament to the harmonious cooperation between human aspiration and divine blessing, between transient ambitions and timeless wisdom. They serve as a reminder to everyone who gazes upon them that the greatest achievements of civilization are born not only from human pride, but also from the humble realization that our most significant successes are gifts that must be returned to the sources from which they came. As the moon majestically rises over Mount Parnassus, and its silvery glow bathes the ancient stones of Apollo's sanctuary, the sacred mountain of the Oracle plunges into the blissful silence that marked the end of countless days throughout its many centuries of glorious history. pilgrims have already returned to their distant homes, carrying with them the sought-after divine guidance and unforgettable impressions of this unique place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. The priests have completed their evening rituals, ensuring that Apollo's temple remains pure and fully prepared to receive all seekers of wisdom that a new day may bring. The treasuries stand enveloped in lunar splendor, their marble walls carefully preserving gifts symbolizing humanity's deep gratitude for wisdom bestowed from above. However, the true treasure of Delphi is not contained within any of these structures, nor locked away in any of their vaults. It resides in the profound realization that wisdom always remains attainable for those who seek it with a pure and sincere heart. It lies in the understanding that divine guidance continually flows into the world for everyone who possesses sufficient humility to listen to it, and that the questions asked are sometimes far more significant than the answers we seem to crave. The Oracle of Delphi constantly reminds us that the very search for wisdom is a sacred form of worship, that the path to understanding truth is holy, regardless of what ultimate goal is achieved. Ascending the winding mountain path to Apollo's temple, ancient pilgrims found not only answers to their pressing problems, but also attained a deeper understanding of the great mysteries that fill life with true meaning. And in the quiet pre-dawn hours, when the world holds its breath, on the border between night and the coming day, the sacred vapours still rise from the depths of the mountain, carrying with them the enduring possibility that divine wisdom remains accessible to any age, to any culture, to any person who approaches the sacred with genuine reverence and an open heart.